Junji Ito is an artist of which a lot has been said. Even if you've never read one of Ito's works, I guarantee you something scary that you like was inspired by him. Some of the most thought-provoking and interesting concepts to come from the darkest places of the human mind are Ito's doing. To the degree that when people say things like, Japanese know how to make the scariest stories you can imagine, they're probably referring to Ito in some way. And I myself am a pretty big fan. While I don't have every single work Ito's ever done, I think there's a few more I need to get, I think that I'm pretty close. And while I haven't read all of them yet, I've at least read about half of them, and I can say that his reputation is well earned. From stories of head-shaped balloons coming to kill people, to giant holes in mountains that humans are compelled to throw themselves into, some of the most outlandish and terrifying concepts come from his mind. And the one that I want to talk about today is one of his most well-known, and in my opinion, one of his most weird. And that story is, of course, Uzumaki. Even if you've never read Uzumaki, like I said earlier, I guarantee you've probably seen an image of it floating around online. See, normally Ito works with short stories, these little contained doses of micro-horror that quickly introduce a character and setting to get a scare across. But Uzumaki, as you can probably tell, is pretty big. All 20 chapters of this relate to the horror of a spiral. And if you're wondering how some of the most terrifying concepts within horror media can be brought about by a shape, then stick around because today we're going to talk about Junji Ito's Uzumaki. I've talked about Ito before on the channel. Whenever I covered Frankenstein, I talked about Ito's adaptation of the work. And I've always been fascinated about his incredibly unique approach to setting up a scare. Like normally, authors will use real-world settings or concepts to build up their monster, but it seems that Ito works the other way around and makes the monster paramount to his pieces. But we'll talk about that as we get into the story. Uzumaki has some of the most unsettling depictions I've seen in horror stories. It has some of the weirdest depictions that I've seen in horror stories. So what I want to do today is go through the story of Uzumaki, talk about my favorite parts, talk about my least favorite parts, what works, what doesn't. At least, according to this amateur YouTuber's opinion, that doesn't really matter. And I've wanted to cover Ito for a while on the channel as, his own standalone video. So might as well start at one of his most popular. Couple things to note before we start. For one, viewer discretion, because while a lot of the topics we're going to talk about are insane and outlandish, you'll be amazed by how graphic and upsetting some of those images within that setting can be. And two, and most importantly, if you have never read Uzumaki, then I don't want to take that away from you. While I really like the story and I'm excited to talk about it, I'm even more excited for you to experience the story firsthand yourself. So read it online, order the book, what have you, and then come back to this video. Because I think it's something really special and I don't want you to lose the opportunity of experiencing it yourself. So go read it, come back, and then we'll talk about it. With that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get into the story, but as always, thank you for watching. Let's give some background about this story before we get into it, so you all can better understand where the story comes from. Ito himself began producing comics in 1987, but the story of Uzumaki didn't come about until over a decade later in 1998. Then, from 1998 to 1999, Uzumaki was published in Big Comic Spirits Weekly. As a part of that weekly comic strip, every week a new edition of Uzumaki would be released. Again, 19 in the original edition, and then when the full print was put together as one piece, he added a 20th lost issue. From 2001 to 2002, the Viz Media publication known as Pulp put out an English translation of the story for the first time. The publication garnered so much attention in Japan that before it was even translated to English in the year 2000, a live-action film was made, as well as 2 video games that again were both made in the year 2000. At the time of recording, Adult Swim is even making an anime adaptation of the series that is set to be released eventually. So in other words, this story got really popular really fast, and it's not hard to see why. And to understand why it became so popular, why don't I stop yapping and let you see for yourself? I mean, I'm going to keep yapping, just why don't I yap about telling you the story instead of yapping about how I'm going to be yapping about telling you the story. Yeah. Beginning with Chapter 1. It opens with a girl named Kirie Goshima telling us of Kurozucho, a town she grew up in. And through all the insanity we're about to get into, Kurosacho is the center of the story. Kirie lives with her mom, dad, and younger brother, and for the most part, life seems to be simple, at least as of now. Kurosacho is a coastal town that is built in a sort of crescent within the mountains. The geography implies the town to be isolated and kind of to itself, but again, as mentioned, life seems to be going easy. Kirie begins to make her way to the nearby train station to see her boyfriend, Shuichi, and as she does, the first strange occurrence of the story happens when, for seemingly no reason at all, a small twister blows right past her. No time to think about that, because right after this happens, Kirie sees Shuichi's father crouched down in an alleyway. She gets closer and tries to call out to him, but he doesn't respond. Instead, he is staring intently at a snail. And despite his son's girlfriend standing right there calling out to him, he is transfixed on the shell of this creature. Kirie leaves him to it and goes to the train station to see her boyfriend. She mentions that her boyfriend, Shuichi, goes to school outside of the town, and every day after class is over, takes the train to return back to town. This will be important later. Kirie brings up his father's strange behavior, and Shuichi responds by saying, yeah, he's been really weird lately, before abruptly asking Kirie if she'd run away with him. When she asked why, he says it's because something about this town just doesn't feel right. As he's talking about this, a siren begins to sound in the center of town, a noise that Shuichi can't stand. He mentions how he hates the sirens, he hates the dim ocean on the coast, he hates the old abandoned lighthouse, and he hates the mountains that surround the town. He remarks that the town itself is infested with spirals. Now let's pretend that you didn't buy a book that has a giant spiral on the cover. The word Uzumaki is Japanese for spiral or swirl. Or let's pretend you didn't click on a YouTube video that had the word spiral in the thumbnail. Those aside, we've already seen a couple hints of this spiral imagery. For one, the opening panel of Kirie in the grass outside of her high school featured these spiral designs in nature itself. And of course, we saw Shuichi's father staring at a snail, the shell of which is of course a spiral. Kirie kind of brushes this statement off, and it says the next day, Shuichi's father goes to see Kirie's father. Kirie had mentioned earlier that her father is a potter and is known for making extravagant designs and beautiful imagery within his pottery. So, being very weird about the whole thing, Shuichi's father goes to Kirie's father and asks him to make a bowl with a spiral in it. Shuichi's dad goes on and on about the beauty of spirals, how magnificent they are, and says that money is no object. Kirie's dad, Mr. Goshima, agrees to do it, but everyone is very hesitant about his new spiral obsession. The next day, Shuichi tells Kirie about how bad this obsession has become. Not only has his dad completely transfixed himself with spirals by taking any object he can find that's remotely spiral shaped and filling his house with it, but it takes up every part of his daily activity. He doesn't go to work anymore so that he can just sit around and look at spirals all day. Every time he gets in the bath, he has to stir the water to make it a spiral before he can get in. They had soup one night and there wasn't any spiral fish cakes in the soup, so he freaked out and had to spin the soup to make a spiral appear before he could calm down. To show Kirie how bad it's gotten, Shuichi invites her over for dinner. Shuichi begins to point out how spirals are infesting the town in other ways. Like the whirlwind I mentioned earlier that just blew by Kirie isn't exactly normal. Not only that, but the rivers that flow through town have these tiny little tide pools in them. The imagery of the spiral is beginning to infect everything. When the two arrive to Shuichi's house, there's a fight going on because Shuichi's mom threw out all of the spirals. The dad is, of course, furious that his wife threw out his new obsession, before stating he doesn't even need those things anymore because he can make spirals himself. And then sure enough, he begins to spin his eyes independently of each other, causing spirals to form within his head. A few days later, Kirie's dad finishes the bowl that he was making for Shuichi's dad. He asks Kirie to deliver it, and begrudgingly, Kirie takes it over. When she gets there, Shuichi's dad says he doesn't need the bowl anymore because he's found ways to express spirals with his own body. And then, on command in front of this poor child, he rolls his tongue out of his mouth and makes it into a gigantic spiral. Kirie is understandably freaked out by this and she takes off out the door. As she's leaving, a delivery man is coming by to drop off an order for Shuichi's dad. We don't see what the order is initially, but after this, we're told that a few days later, Shuichi's dad died. At his cremation, we find out that the official story is that he died by falling down the stairs. But Shuichi tells Kirie the full story. After this package arrived, Shuichi and his mom couldn't find Dad anywhere. They search through the house before they see a suspicious round box laid on the floor. When they go up to the box and open the lid, they find this. Shuichi's dad, so obsessed with the idea of the spiral, turned himself into one, contorting his body and breaking his bones to make himself into his ideal shape. The process, of course, killing him. Before we have time to process this, people begin to scream and shout to look up into the sky, and as we do, we see that the ashes and smoke of Shuichi's dad is formed into a giant spiral. And with that, chapter 1 ends. Now, that's a lot, and before we get into chapter 2, I want to talk about a few things that were prominent or need to be talked about from chapter 1. Because if you thought chapter 1 is confusing, like, oh, a guy turned himself into a spiral, that's really weird, I promise you're not ready for where this is about to end up. Because by no exaggeration, the guy twisting himself into a macaroni noodle in a tub is the most normal thing that's going to happen for the rest of the story. Because from here, it's going to get more scary and weird and unexplainable, and you're going to be really confused and either really love it or really hate it, and I don't care. So let's talk about a couple of takeaways from chapter 1. But before we continue talking about something that's terrifying and confusing, let's talk about something else that's also terrifying and confusing, like debt management. I'm sure all of us have some kind of debt, if that's either medical bills or personal loans or credit cards. And living on its own can be pretty expensive, so it's understandable to let what you owe get away from you. But now, all of that confusion can be cleared up in one easy step, thanks to today's sponsor, PDS Debt. PDS Debt allows you to consolidate all of your different payments in one place so that if you are making payments every month and your debt isn't going down, then PDS Debt is right for you. Everyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score. So PDS Debt allows you to save a lot of money in things like interest and fees, and also makes the payment process easier and quicker. And I know what you're thinking, any brand or sponsor that deals with money or wealth management is a pretty serious deal. So don't take it from me, take it from people who have tried out PDS Debt themselves. Not only are they a top-rated company on Google, at the time of recording they have 4.9 stars, but they even have an A+ on the Better Business Bureau's rankings. Help is available, and when dealing with something as serious as debt, it's nice to have a professional in your corner. Let PDS Debt be that friend. And to see if PDS Debt is right for you, today I'm coming to you with a special offer. That's because if you head to pdsdebt.com/Wendigoon, you will be able to get a debt assessment for free. That is right, for free. In as little as 30 seconds, you can see if PDS Debt works for you by just trying out their debt analysis program for free to see if it's something that can help you out today. Again, head to pdsdebt.com/Wendigoon to get in on this exclusive offer now. Thank you all so much for watching the ad, and thank you so much to PDS Debt for sponsoring this video. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description, and we are back to the video. For one, if you're not familiar with Ito's art style beforehand, you are now. The incredible amount of detail that he gives to these images is enthralling. Like, it's one thing to be a great storyteller, and it's another thing to be a great artist, but to be both at the same time is mind-blowing. The way he leads you into these scares, the kind of anticipation of he's going to die, what's that going to look like, it's going to be spiral related, what's the method, what's going to happen, and then you see it, and it is just as grisly and awful as the worst parts of your brain could have imagined. I love it. And another interesting detail that I didn't really realize, because to be honest, Ito is the first manga artist I've read more than maybe 1 or 2 issues of, is how well the pacing of these panels works together. Like, for example, and for those of you who have never read manga before, you actually read it backwards. Like, this is your book, right? So in English, we would start here and turn it this way. On manga, you do it the opposite direction because that's just how the Japanese text makes more sense. So as you turn these pages and as the story's laid out, you're given more and more hints to the horror you're about to see. And the way that your eyes glide across the panels, it just works so well, the pacing between them. But where it really gets you is in the jump scares. See, Ito is such a master of the craft that he knows how to jump scare you with the pages of a book. See, like here, we have the funeral for his father, and we see the cremation, and then we hear the note that the way we told everyone he died isn't how he actually died, so that builds suspense. We go into the next page, and we see them searching for his father. We see the tub, what could it be? And then we have the panel shots of them looking at the tub, slowly moving the lid, peering in, so we know whatever the next shot is what's inside of that tub, and then you turn the page, and bam, we get a full spread in your face. It's terrifying. I love it. It's so fascinating that an author can take these images, just still panels, they don't make any noise, they don't move, and can portray them in such a way that sitting alone at night, reading the book, you jump, you scream to yourself, because that's how well he knows to make the horror come to life. But enough gushing about Ito's capability as an author, for now at least. I want to talk about some of the aspects we've seen in the story. We saw that Shuichi's father became so obsessed with the spirals that he quite literally became one. And we also saw mention, even explicitly by Shuichi, that spirals are infecting the town. But so far the only example we've seen of that in an individual is Shuichi's dad. So are there just spirals around town and his father developed a unique attraction to them? Or is his father just the first victim of something much greater? Well, there's another 19 issues left, so you tell me. Chapter 2 picks up right where Chapter 1 left off, with the giant spiral of ash appearing in the sky. The spiral goes into the air and then begins to go down at a place called Dragonfly Pond. Dragonfly Pond is the center of the town and is also right next to Shuichi and Kirie's houses. Everyone is freaked out by the giant smoke cloud, especially Shuichi's mom, who sees her husband's face appear in the smoke. She freaks out and has a panic attack, being rushed to the hospital immediately. As soon as she's there, she begins to see spirals everywhere and becomes terrified. From seeing a nurse's hair bun and screaming, and realizing there's spirals on the end of her fingertips, to which she peels her fingerprints off. She shaves her head to prevent any spirals from appearing, and anyone who goes to visit her has to cover their hands and hair just in case she sees a spiral in it. When Shuichi and his mom go to an appointment with the doctor at the hospital, Shuichi notices on a board behind the doctor that there is a diagram of the human ear, which, for those of you that don't know, contains a spiral. Shuichi very quickly does the math and realizes if his mom figures out there's a spiral inside of her head, that won't go well. So he makes an excuse to get her out of the room. That night, while sleeping in the hospital bed, a centipede crawls up his mother's bed and tries to get inside of her ear. She freaks out, throws the centipede across the room, to which it curls up in a spiral on the ground, and in the spiral, she sees the reflection of her husband's body, calling for her to join him in the spiral, and mentioning that there's a spiral inside of her ear. The next day she freaks out, goes to the doctor's office, and demands to see his poster that would depict a spiral in the human ear, but thankfully the doctor also realized what Shuichi realized and took down the posters so that his mother wouldn't, try to get the spiral out. This works for now until that night when, just before she's to be transmitted to a mental health hospital, a spiral begins to form in the IV bag next to her bed, and once again, she hears her husband calling out to her. The phrase is repeated again that there's a spiral inside of her head. So to make sure that that spiral can't hurt her, she takes a pair of scissors and digs out her inner ear. Something I really appreciate about Ito's works is that even though a lot of these concepts are so far out there or absurd on initial reading, he manages to slip in moments like this of just extreme body horror and graphic content that can hit anyone, regardless of how outlandish the topic around the setting actually is. Despite having these grandiose themes, he knows how to keep the terror personal. By ripping out her inner ear, she didn't only destroy her hearing, but she also destroyed her sense of balance. Because for those of you that don't know, your inner ear is also a sensory organ that allows your body to understand, if it's upright, laid down, keep your sense of balance. So by ripping those out, she places herself in a permanent state of vertigo. Just a few days after this, Shuichi's mother dies, and when she is cremated, once again, a spiral forms in the sky and goes down into Dragonfly Pond. These first two chapters give us an interesting introduction into the world of Uzumaki. While so far only 2 people have been directly affected by the spiral curse, we see already the damage it can cause. with two people destroying their lives for either the fear or worship of this spiral idea. And while for now it's just been Shuichi's family that's been destroyed by the curse, as we'll soon find out, they are the first victim of many. From here, we launch into a much more anthology-oriented telling of Uzumaki, because the mainline narrative of having the chapters quickly bounce off of each other and keep a definitive through line mainly occurs at the beginning and the end of the story. So for these next few stories, it's kind of a collection of bad things happening around the town and how that affects Kirie. So while I'm going to get through these comparatively quickly, they're important because they deliver some of the best and most iconic scares of the entire story. I mention that now especially because Chapter 3 is probably the most famous chapter of the entire book. Chapter 3 begins by introducing us to Kirie's friend, Azami. Azami is loved by all of the boys at school, and the other girls begin to tell stories that the reason for this attraction is a scar on her forehead. Azami talks about this to Kirie, saying that when she was a young girl, she was trying to get boys' attention, fell off of the monkey bars at school, hit her head, and has had the scar ever since. But seemingly by coincidence, ever since she got that scar, men couldn't take their eyes off of her. And while some may view this as a curse, Azami loves the attention. We're also told that since the first two chapters and his parents' death, Shuichi has spent his time outside of school alone in his now empty house, to which Kirie frequently goes to visit him. Azami says that she wants to meet Shuichi and asks to accompany Kirie after school. Again, as mentioned earlier, Shuichi goes to school outside of the town, so most of the high school kids know of him but aren't personal friends with him. Kirie agrees, and when they get to Shuichi's house, we see the state that Shuichi is living in. He's curled up in the corner of his room, of course broken by the events of the story thus far. However, when he sees Azami, he immediately loses his mind. He tells her to get out, and after the two of them leave, Kirie apologizes, but Azami says she understands. Considering, the guy's parents just died, he's probably not in the best state of mind. That night, however, Shuichi calls Kirie to explain his reaction. He says that as soon as he saw Azami, it was as if he was staring into a spiral. As he is explaining to Kirie over the phone what he means by this, Azami visits his house in the middle of the night. She says that the reason she's doing this is because he's the first boy who hasn't looked at her with anything other than admiration, and she wants to know why. Shuichi is once again terrified and says that it's whatever's on her forehead, it's as if he's staring into a spiral. She looks in the mirror and sees that the once crescent scar has now expanded into, you guessed it, the shape of a spiral. After this, she leaves, but Azami becomes obsessed with Shuichi. As mentioned, Azami loves male attention, and Shuichi is the first guy to ever turn her down, and she can't let that be. As a matter of fact, when Kirie goes to Azami and says that she doesn't want Azami visiting her boyfriend anymore, Azami refuses and says that she's going to make Shuichi love her more than he loves Kirie. As they're talking, another unexplainable whirlwind rolls by, blowing Azami's hair out of the way, revealing to us that the scar has gotten much bigger and, as it appears, deeper. After this, we see the intensity of other men's infatuation with Azami, as a boy named Okada shows up in the place that she's hiding, and after being told to leave, says he won't because he can't stand to not look at her. As you can probably imagine, men's attraction with her goes further than just basic infatuation. It, once again, has to do with the spiral. That night, Shuichi calls Kirie, saying that a guy named Okada wants to meet him in the park to talk to him. Kirie runs to the park where Shuichi is going to be meeting Okada, and when she gets there, she runs into none other than Azami. When confronted, Azami says that something feels weird in her face, and when she pulls away her hat, we are shown this. The entire top half of her head has become a deep, deep spiral pit, and as she's standing there, the pit grows just enough to slowly drag in one of Azami's eyes. Now, this image is easily one of the most famous from the book, and there's good reason as to why. We're given context as to what this image means now. The spiral on her head is growing and slowly consuming her face, but even if you didn't know any of that going in, this image is terrifying on its own. What that must feel like to have a hole in your face, perhaps the gravity of which is deeper than your face itself. And of course, the image of the eye slowly wrapping its way into the back of the head is fantastic. One of the things I love so much about Uzumaki, and really any of Ito's works, is the setting can really be whatever he wants it to be as long as we get moments like this. Yes, the story's interesting. Yes, the narrative points and characters are interesting. But what really does it is turning a page to see a woman's eye falling into her spiral injury on her skull. It's one of the touches of Ito that's really hard to find anywhere else. Azami continues into the park to where Shuichi is meeting Okada. After speaking to him, Shuichi realizes that Okada never actually wanted to talk to Shuichi in the first place. Instead, Azami had just put Okada up to do it so that she could get Shuichi alone. Okada was told that if he does this, Azami would go out with him. And when she says she wants nothing to do with him, Okada gets mad, rips the hat off her head to reveal the spiral's gotten even bigger. Now both of her eyes are gone, and what's left of her face is carved in a devilish grin. Okada, mesmerized by the sight, begins to reach his hand towards Azami when he is suddenly sucked into the spiral. Not only that, but the spiral begins to rapidly grow and grow and grow, consuming Okada and Azami entirely. No trace is left of the two, and with that we have the end of chapter 3. Now, I've already talked about how effective the imagery works here, but the curse and the way it manifested in Azami is interesting. See, so far, given chapters 1 and 2, we have an easy timeline for how this spiral curse began. Shuichi's dad developed an obsession for it, and then he died of it, and then his mom developed a phobia of it, and then she died from it. So we can assume that patient X in this scenario was his father. But Azami mentioned that she got the scar on her forehead, which later turned out to be supernatural, at a very young age, and ever since then boys were infatuated with her. So this places the timeline for potential spiral shenanigans back at least a decade. Whatever this curse is, it could hypothetically infect anyone, and perhaps even more terrifying, it could have been affecting them for a really long time, and we just don't know it until now. Things to keep in mind as we move into chapter 4. Chapter 4 opens by telling us that since the death of Shuichi's parents, every person that is cremated in the town becomes a smoke spiral. And all of these spirals do the exact same thing. They go up into the sky before falling back down into Dragonfly Pond, which is once again the center of town. As mentioned earlier in the story, Kirie's father, Mr. Goshima, is a potter. So the kiln where he creates his pottery is located right next to Dragonfly Pond, and it seems that he is the next person to be affected by whatever this curse is. Kirie's father has become obsessed with his work, spending several sleepless days next to the fire of his kiln. When we see what this pottery looks like, it's all bent up and covered in spiral shapes. While most see this as a problem, Mr. Goshima says that he actually enjoys it because he sees the spiral as a true form of art. What's interesting to me about Kirie's father is where Shuichi's father was visibly crazy, drooling, mad, freaking out over just staring at his spirals. Kirie's father seems to be much more collected in his thoughts and trying to explain his point about why spirals are so important. Of course, we can see this as being a part of the same insanity, but it's almost like if the curse has moved from Shuichi's father to now Kirie's father, it's like the curse has adjusted itself of how to better long last or better fit in with the environment around it. It's almost like the curse is learning. When the Goshima family is looking at the pottery and points out that not only are they covered in spirals, but they seem to be covered in the faces of the dead, including Shuichi's parents, he remarks with, "Well, that's odd," chalking it up to the earth and how a potter can never truly understand his clay and blah blah blah. And in the meantime continues to make his pottery in the kiln next to Dragonfly Pond. Kirie's mother is understandably worried about Shuichi because, again, his parents died and he's living in a house by himself now, and for some reason they don't just invite him to stay over with them, but whatever. So one night Kirie's mom says that she should have Shuichi over for dinner. When Kirie goes to get Shuichi, he says that he is hesitant to go to her house because it's so close to that pond. I'll talk about it more as it becomes more evident later in the story, but it's frustrating how Shuichi is consistently right about everything, and everyone around him, especially Kirie, just brushes him off as crazy and weird, despite things around them being crazy and weird. As Shuichi is eating dinner, he freaks out because at the bottom of his bowl is a spiral. Because despite all the spiral imagery going on around town, Kirie's parents thought it would be fitting to feed the boy, who has now lost 2 parents to spirals, a plate with a spiral on it. Mr. Goshima tries to convince Shuichi that the spiral is actually beautiful, and that Shuichi's dad understood better than most the importance of the spiral. And in his search for the spiral, that is why Mr. Goshima began to make his pottery using mud from Dragonfly Pond. And that explains why the pottery is covered in spirals and, dead people. Shuichi is disgusted by this and storms out the door, and we are told that for several nights on end, Mr. Goshima goes into the water of Dragonfly Pond, comes out with mud, and builds pottery incessantly. One night, while her father is sleeping by the kiln, Kirie decides to peek into the kiln to see what's being made. And what is inside of the kiln is the burning spirits of those who have been cremated within the town. Once again, I have to mention the way this is purveyed. We see Kirie look into the fire, and then as the page turns, boom, a full panel of people on fire, or I guess mud souls of people on fire, with the souls of Shuichi's parents calling out to him specifically, asking him to make the suffering end, that the heat is unbearable. Kirie's father wakes up and tells her to go inside, and as she lays there, hearing the screaming coming from within the oven, Shuichi calls her. Shuichi says that he can hear his parents screaming, he can hear something coming from the kiln, and he's going to do something about it. Shuichi comes over, gets into a fight with Mr. Goshima, and in a moment of rage, throws a brick into the oven. As soon as he does, the oven explodes, and the pottery and mud and souls of the dead come flying out. The way this is depicted, with the faces and the pottery as some kind of escape from hell, is so well done. From this, the entire building catches on fire, and all that is left is rubble. The next day, Mr. Goshima begins to pick through the wreckage, seeing what kind of pots can still be used, indicating that his obsession, at least in some small part, is here to stay. And with that, we have the end of chapter 4. So we see here that Mr. Goshima has definitely fallen for the spiral curse to some degree, right? But what's interesting is as soon as the oven explodes, it's almost like it lets him go, at least a little bit. Because as soon as the oven explodes and the building catches on fire, he doesn't get mad at Shuichi, he doesn't threaten him for destroying his kiln. The first thing he does is try to get Shuichi out of the building. And then yes, the next day he's still picking through the rubble trying to see what kind of spiral pots can be salvaged. But I'll go ahead and tell you, for the rest of the manga, up until the very end, he's pretty normal. Which is weird considering he was the guy making, pots out of dead people up until then. I have a theory for why that is that I can explain better as we get further into the story. But for now, I'll say I think the curse, if it does have some kind of mind or consciousness, sort of let him go after it realized it couldn't use him anymore. Because if his manifestation of the curse was making pottery that contains spirals, and now the kiln's destroyed so he can no longer make pottery, the curse doesn't have a use for him. Now, this theory isn't airtight. There's stuff later in the story that kind of refutes it, but that's at least the mindset I have for why in the next few chapters he's just having casual conversations and never brings up a spiral. And some of this theory is me kind of giving the story the benefit of the doubt, because again, aside from some dialogue at the tail end of the story, there's not a lot of explanation for why the things that happen within the story actually happen. But again, when we get cool shots like the oven souls flying out all over the room and setting the building on fire, I'll let it pass. He can have as many plot holes as he wants, and as long as we still get a woman's eye falling into her spiral face, I don't care. Chapter 5 is cool because it works very well as a contained story and has almost nothing to do with Kirie or Shuichi at all. I mean, they're present in the story, but the events of it doesn't really affect either of them. At the beginning of chapter 5, we are told that there are a series of old row houses throughout town. Row houses are exactly what it sounds like. A house that is built in a row. Basic one-level houses that within the story are being used by people in the town who experience poverty. Kirie comes across 2 families that are living in the same row house, because the way these houses are made is it's one structure and then there's wall dividers to separate different rooms that different people live within. So 2 families that have separate rooms within the same row house are fighting each other because their children have fallen in love with each other. A son named Kazunori and the other family's daughter named Yuriko are basically a Romeo and Juliet scenario. Both of the families hate each other for reasons either probably can't remember, and because of that, they don't want the kids to conjugate. After Kazunori is knocked down by Yuriko's older brother, he explains all of this to Kirie. Another fun detail is the walls of the row house are so thin that people in separate rooms can constantly hear each other. So when Kazunori goes back to his mom and explains what happens, the family immediately gets in a fight with the other family through the thin wall, implying that this is what their life is like constantly, with them fighting 24/7 and being able to hear whatever the other family says. Kirie goes to explain all of this to Shuichi, and Shuichi says that whatever is happening to them can't be helped because it's much deeper than just two families that don't like each other. It is an effect of the spiral, effect of the curse on the town, and more specifically, some kind of effect that's happening within the row house. See, what's interesting about the row houses around town is they are much, much older than all the other structures within town. While every other building in the city has been built in the last 50 years, these old abandoned row houses have been around for maybe a couple hundred. So whatever kind of curse has settled within the streets has had an especially long time to fester in those buildings. Shuichi is explaining all of this to Kirie and then once again asks Kirie to run away with him. Kirie is frustrated by this answer and storms off, saying she won't ask Shuichi to help him anymore. This is the second time Shuichi has mentioned trying to get away, but it seems that he won't unless Kirie goes with him. A few days later, Kirie goes up to check on the young couple and sees that their families are in a fight because the two of them have run off and can't be found. We see that the young couple is hiding out in another abandoned row house. While they're in there is a quick scene where the two of them see a couple of snakes, and the snakes are tied around each other, and at first they think the snakes are fighting before realizing that they're actually conjugating. Kirie finds them and hears the two of them planning to run away together. As this happens, Yuriko's parents show up, and once again Kazunori gets punched as the two of them are separated. Kirie agrees to help the two of them escape town. However, when Kirie goes to talk to Kazunori, she doesn't notice it until in retrospect, but we notice it right now. Whenever he goes to get up, he turns his body around the wrong way. Basically, his top half moves in 180 degrees of his lower half. But no time for that, because in the next scene, the two of them are running off to get eloped. Now with Shuichi's help, because Shuichi is going to help Kirie in whatever she decides to do, they meet the young couple who is running because they say their parents saw them leave and are hot on their trail. They run and duck through the alleys, get cut off from the direction to the train station, and make their way onto the beach before the two are caught. However, this time, instead of being separated once again, Kazunori calls out to Yuriko to did it like they did before. And suddenly, both of their bodies begin snapping and twisting as they become these giant spiral figures. Both of them careen up high into the air before locking arms and twisting around each other, just as the snakes we saw earlier. In this twisted form, the two of them slither across the sand and make their way into the ocean, never to be seen again. And that's the end of chapter 5. So once again, we see that the spiral is infecting people throughout the town. If Shuichi is to be believed, which he is because we love him and he can never do any wrong, the very essence of the two families' fight in the first place was because of the spiral curse. And it seems that the young couple had learned to adapt the curse to their own abilities, making themselves again into these big spiral snake things, seemingly having practiced it before but just not told anyone. So the curse is affecting people in both ways that they don't realize and do realize. I also like the premise of that story just for its own little, when you factor in the giant snake kids at the end, it kind of makes it outside of the realm of a slice of life story. But cutting that off, the idea of these two families that are fighting each other, but they live so close to each other they can hear what the other one's saying constantly, is a fun idea. So it's fun to see Ito take that idea and then meld it into his world of curses and the supernatural, and at the end they become the snake ocean monster thing. Once again, we have another example of the curse's capabilities. And also keep the old row houses in mind, they will come into play later. And with that out of the way, let's move into chapter 6. Chapter 6 opens with a very abrupt start as it begins with a student falling off of the school to his death. Turns out this boy was doing gymnastics on the roof of the school, slipped, and then fell. In his final moments, instead of expressing a look of terror, he instead has a smile. Kirie is thinking about this when her friend Sakino says that she gets why the boy was smiling, because all he wanted was attention, and as a matter of fact, that's what Sakino wants too. Kirie goes to talk about what happened to Shuichi. When she gets there, she's explaining to Shuichi what happened, and Shuichi says that he understands because once again this all relates back to the spiral. To which Kirie's response is, not again, what does wanting attention have to do with a spiral? And it's here I'm going to talk about my first main problem with Uzumaki, and really my biggest problem, and that's Kirie. So most of Ito's works are short stories, right? As I mentioned earlier, they would be weekly publications in manga around Japan, stuff like that. And in short stories, things that are 20 to 30 pages long, you don't really need a ton of character development because you just don't have time for it, right? If the purpose of your story is to get a scare or some scary concept across, then you don't really want to waste that time on character development or growth or what have you. And while that's all well and good for, a weekly one-off, and technically I'm reading a collection of 20 weekly one-offs, so I'm cheating a little bit, but nevertheless, it's one continuous through line, so when you're reading that through line and Kirie never learns anything, it gets annoying. That's really one of Ito's most common criticisms, that he's not a fantastic character writer, and that his stories that do portray the most amount of character writing, things like No Longer Human or Frankenstein, are just his adaptations of stories that already existed. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And for an example of that, look at Shuichi. Like, sure, he doesn't get a ton of super deep plot lines through the story, but we see his character learn and adapt to the world as it changes around him. Ito has plenty of examples of long stories with interesting characters, things like Hellstar Remina. It's not that Ito can't write characters in long story form, it's that for some reason, Kirie is one of his short form characters lost within a long form narrative. What I mean by that is in some of Ito's most famous works, like The Enigma of Amagara Fault or The Long Sleep, we have characters who don't really change that much, but they work as a vessel for the story to happen around. And that's pretty much what Kirie is. She is a okay enough person for these events to be happening to. Now personally, even though I said it's my biggest problem with the series, it doesn't take me out of the book that much. Reason number one, this is a serialized story, and it does work as a monster of the week kind of thing. You just kind of have to overlook all the other characters adapting to the world like Shuichi or even the Goshima family and Kirie not doing that, but it works enough. And two, and most importantly, the monsters and scares more than make up for it. That being said, I think a better example of a continuous plot line through a weekly manga edition that works better than Uzumaki as far as its protagonist goes is Tomie. Because rather than having a victim or a normal person be the forefront of the story that all these things are happening around, Tomie instead follows the monster and uses that as the vehicle for the plot. And for one, I think Ito's monsters are the most fascinating parts about his work, so that's a plus. And the monster not developing makes sense because instead of wanting to see the monster develop, we're wanting to see more details of the monster revealed. It is the secret of the, I guess you could say, protagonist, even though it's not really a protagonist. The main focal point of Tomie is the interesting part, whereas when you're reading Uzumaki, you don't care a ton about Kirie, what she's going through, what her background is. You care about the spiral, the monster of the story. In short, Kirie's fine enough for the story, but I understand why she's everyone's least favorite part of it. But I think Ito has better examples of him doing the same thing better in his other works. Another thing I want to bring up here is about Shuichi. See, Shuichi, seemingly from spending most of his days outside of town, still has an acute sensitivity to the effects of the spiral. Everyone else in the town has been lulled into a dullness by spending every waking hour around the spiral town. But it seems that because Shuichi only spends half of his days there, he can still pick up on what the spiral's about to do. It's like he has a sort of radar for it. Similar to how when Azami showed up with a scar on her forehead, he immediately knew that the scar had something to do with the spiral. And here in chapter 6, he knows that this attention-seeking behavior is once again an effect of the spiral. Pretty much whatever he says is going to happen is what happens. So even when the story seems to be hopeless, because he says it's hopeless, he continues to fight for the sake of Kirie. Basically, Shuichi's the best and can do no wrong. Shuichi then remarks that Kirie's hair is starting to curl and she probably should cut it. Because, you know, if hair keeps curling, it eventually makes a spiral. Spiral bad, you get it. Sure enough, Kirie's hair seemingly grows overnight and creates these giant spirals. Initially, she tries to braid her hair, but the hair breaks free of the braids. After that, she tries to get it cut, but her hair attacks the hairdresser and then Kirie herself for trying to get a haircut. So then she goes to school and the hair is just like this giant snake nest thing of its own that is spiraling in the air and twisting around and causing people to stare at it. Again, because it wants attention. At one point, Sakino sees Kirie and gets jealous because she thinks Kirie is doing the giant hair twisting trick on purpose. Eventually, the hair just starts making Kirie go places where more people will look at it. When they go to the station, Shuichi sees her and in disgrace, runs off. She breaks down in tears thinking that Shuichi has abandoned her, but as I mentioned earlier, Shuichi isn't going to do that. While in the middle of public, Sakino shows up again, and her hair is now also a giant Medusa spiral of curls and whatnot. I don't know how Sakino suddenly got the ability to just ask for the curse to give her powers, but here it is. And then, without Kirie controlling it at all, each of their respective hair gets into a hair fight. As the hair lashes back and forth at each other, Kirie remarks that every time the hair grows or moves, it takes energy out of her. We can see this in the faces of both girls as they begin to become emaciated. Shuichi shows back up, bearing a pair of scissors. He had ran to get scissors to try to free Kirie. As soon as Kirie's hair sees what Shuichi is doing, it wraps around him like a snake, and all three counting the hair, fall to the ground. Sakino laughs at them and begins to make her way through town with her hair continuing to do the spinning trick, and Shuichi manages to get close enough to Kirie's head to cut her hair off. So now, thanks to Shuichi, Kirie is saved, but she remarks that as the hair gets bigger, it becomes more draining. Sure enough, we see the effects of that on Sakino. As the hair makes its way to a telephone pole in town and begins to grow its way all the way to the top and branch off around it like a Christmas tree. As this happens, it takes the last bit of life Sakino has, and she dies an emaciated skeleton at the base of the telephone pole, and the story ends by telling us that her hair continued to move for several days. And with that, we have the end of chapter 6. Despite my complaints of Uzumaki not really maintaining consistency with Kirie's character, or at least not progression with Kirie's character, it's too consistent, if anything. One detail I do like is from here out for the rest of the story, Kirie has short hair. Also, the fact that Kirie was cursed, or at least if her mind wasn't effective, her hair was cursed, and then the curse leaves her, further supports the argument I had for her dad earlier in the story to why he goes from freaking out making all these spiral pots and then just forgets about it. It's like the curse moves from person to person to wherever it can be the most effective. Also, another detail that you're probably thinking about the story that you kind of just have to give Ito with the work for any of this to happen is why don't people just leave? Because supposedly Shuichi is able to leave town on the train every day. Why don't they just take the train and then not come back? Well, Shuichi won't do it because Kirie won't. And the reason Kirie and everyone else won't isn't really established, but it would make sense if the spiral curse is kind of subtly affecting everyone to make them not want to leave town. It also seems to push a sort of level of ignorance to everything that's going on around them, because a ton of people witness things like the ash spirals in the sky and the spirals of Sakino's hair. And then when the next story comes around, they're oblivious to new occurrences of the spiral. I mean, in chapter 6, Kirie's dad sees her spiral hair and doesn't make any kind of connection between the giant spiral death pots he was making out in the shed that blew up. It seems that the spiral is causing everyone to kind of forget previous instances of it, or if not forget, not care about. This is also another reason why Shuichi feels like he's going insane, because he seems to be the only one making these connections around people who don't care. Chapter 7 has some of my favorite horror imagery from the entire book, so let's get into it. Chapter 7 opens by telling us of a 7th grader named Mitsuru who lives in town. Mitsuru has a habit of jumping out and scaring people. It's his favorite thing to do. Kirie and her friend Shiho, also Kirie has had a recurring thing of, oh, Kirie has a friend and then her friend dies. Shiho is the first friend who does not immediately die after this story. So that's cool. So Kirie and Shiho get so annoyed by Mitsuru that they decide to avoid him. They're going to cut through the old cemetery after school. Shiho says that they've started burying people again, something that hasn't been done in the town for quite some time. When Kirie asks why, Shiho says because every time they burn someone in town, their cremation causes the smoke spiral to form. But not only that, people from the town who die and are cremated elsewhere cause a spiral to form as well. I like that, the subtle note that just living in the town for a while can affect the sky wherever you end up. And seemingly all of these smoke spirals end up in Dragonfly Pond. While Kirie and Shiho are talking about this and reflecting on the fact that that means now there are fresh bodies under them as they walk through the cemetery, Mitsuru once again jumps out from behind a headstone. Mitsuru uses this opportunity to profess his love for Kirie, asking her to go out with him. Because Kirie is way too old for him and also has a boyfriend and also can't stand him, she says no and storms off. After this, Mitsuru begins to follow Kirie everywhere, jumping out to surprise her and professing his love. One day, Mitsuru leaves a gift for Kirie outside of her house, and without even opening it, she immediately goes to return it because she wants nothing to do with him. Mitsuru says he is going to perform a grand gesture to prove his love for her. And to do that, he is going to jump in front of a car right now and will stop it with the power of his love. A very 7th grade childish thing to try. This of course does not work, and instead, Mitsuru is hit by the oncoming car. One of the most effective images in this manga comes when we get a shot of Mitsuru's body crammed up inside of the wheel well with his bloodied head hanging out. Again, it's like I talked about earlier with Shuichi's mom cutting out her cochlea. Like, we have this grand setup of a town with this ancient curse and all the terrifying things it can create, but we still get these moments of like very real, very brutal shots that stick with you. I love how Ito is able to do that in such a fantastical setting. Kirie is, of course, tore up by this and decides to open the present that Mitsuru got her. The present is, of course, a jack-in-the-box. Kirie feels bad about the whole thing and calls Shuichi to make her feel better, but as she's talking to him, she hears the jack-in-the-box speak to her. And the jack-in-the-box says that Mitsuru will come back to get her. Shuichi hears this and says, all right, vampires, know what I gotta do. So the next scene is Shuichi and Kirie going to dig up Mitsuru's body so Shuichi can stab him with a wooden stake. Shuichi's my favorite character in the story for a lot of reasons, but I love the idea of a guy being on the phone with his girlfriend, and the girlfriend's like, I think this young boy that died at school, I think he's gonna come to get me. And he's like, all right, I got a shovel, you've got a stick, let's go. Let's go take care of this, chop chop. I love the way the panels are framed in the following scenes of Shuichi digging up the grave and then slowly prying out the nails before suddenly the panel on the front of the coffin flies open. They at first assume it's from maybe the pressure inside of the coffin until all of a sudden, again in a page-turner jump scare, the head of Mitsuru pops out, followed by a loud banging as he begins to throw himself at the roof of the coffin when suddenly the lid flies off and along with it, he comes up out of the grave. The level of detail and just gnarly characteristics that Ito gives corpses throughout his books is always very uncanny, but especially when they begin to move. It's amazing how much fluidity and implied motion can be got across with just still frames. Because as Kirie and Shuichi begin to run, the corpse of Mitsuru begins to leap after them. With every step, the stitching on the corpse begins to tear as a leg flies off and internal organs and then the other leg. Until eventually, the top half of Mitsuru is propelled by a spring sticking out of his abdomen. Until eventually the corpse leaps to the point that it is nothing, and Shuichi and Kirie point out that the spring attached to his lower abdomen was one of the shock springs from the car that hit him. And with that, Story just ends with Mitsuru's body rotting on the ground in the cemetery. I really like chapter 7. I think it's one of the more interesting sort of one-off pieces within Uzumaki. And it also has the least to do with the spiral out of anything in Uzumaki. Because think about it. We have the spiral imagery at the very end with the spring coming out of his chest, even though it's revealed to not be a supernatural spring. It's just the effect from the car that hit him and was still left inside of the corpse. So while we can assume him coming back from the dead is an effect of the spiral curse, there's no explicit spiral stuff or supernatural spiral stuff that happens. It's just a body raised from the dead, which could be any supernatural story, right? And aside from that, and the mention that we get at the beginning of the story about people are being buried because every time they're cremated, it creates a smoke spiral, the story is pretty light on the spiral stuff. But as it's contained, it's a fun campfire story. A girl has a young boy fall in love with him, who he wants to be a jack-in-the-box and surprise people. She doesn't reciprocate that love, so he dies in a car accident, and then he comes back from the grave as a jack-in-the-box one last time. It's a fun little horror tale. And again, another example of how far this curse can go. Because even though I said that while yes, in another story, it's not like someone coming back from the dead is explicitly a spiral curse, within this story we can assume it to be a spiral curse. So this is another effect of what the spiral is capable of. So we move from that one to what is probably, let me think about this. Yes, what is almost definitely the weirdest short in the entire book, with chapter 8. Chapter 8 opens with Kirie and Shiho once again, our first surviving friend of a chapter. It opens with the two of them in school on a rainy day, talking about how one student named Katayama only shows up whenever it rains. Sure enough, Katayama shows up, and he is depicted as a very ugly and wet man. He's also said to be very slow. He moves slow everywhere, he doesn't react to anything fast, and that day during PE, they're playing volleyball, and when the ball comes to him, he just stands there. The school bullies, who were, I guess, very excited to win a volleyball game, decide to beat him up for it. To bully him, they yank off his clothes and drag him out into the hallway, and when he's dragged out naked into the hallway, everyone sees that there's a spiral pattern on his back. Katayama doesn't really have a reaction to this and instead just kind of worms his way back into the locker room. And then the next day, the spiral's even bigger. And then the day after that, he shows up to school with a half-slug body and a giant snail shell on his back. Everyone screams and freaks out at this as he makes his way to his seat. And then, assumedly, he just spends the rest of the day at school looking like that. And then the day after that, he doesn't show up in school, but rather on the school, as at this point, he is transformed nearly entirely into a giant snail. He is leaving a snail trail on the side of the school as he makes his way across the windows, and then all of a sudden, his eyes turn into giant eye stalks that fly out of his head. So the teachers get together and they're like, we have to do something. So they call his parents to come pick him up, and when his parents get there, they see the giant snail on the outside of the building, and the teachers are like, that's your son? And they're like, that's not funny, and leave. So because no one comes to pick up the snail child, the school just decides to keep him in a pen outside of the school. And Sumura, the bully who had bullied him earlier and dragged him out naked, from the locker room, just keeps bullying him. He's like poking his eye stalk with a stick to make it go back into his head. This is kind of what I mean, as it seems the spiral curse is making everyone dull to how strange the effects of it are, because one of the students literally becomes a snail, and everyone else is like, ha, it's what he gets for being slow and ugly. Over the next several days, Sumura also begins to experience snail-like symptoms. He needs to drink a lot more water, and he begins to feel really slow, and then one day he shows up to school as a giant snail. I will say, the idea of someone or a student becoming a giant snail is inherently goofy, right? There's no way around that. That being said, this one shot of Sumura outside of the school window where you can see like where the top row of his teeth were and where his hair was and stuff like that, and you see like how his body amalgamated into a snail is pretty creepy. Like, goofiness aside, it is an effective use of body horror to imagine your own body contorting into that shape. So what does the school do with now the second child that's become a snail? They just throw him in the pen with the first one. And as soon as the two of them are in the pen together, someone points out that snails are hermaphrodites, so it doesn't matter what they were before they became a snail, because now the two of them are mating. Which I'm sure there's some message there about, haha, bullies, be careful who you're mean to, because one day you may have children with them. Sure enough, one day Kirie goes outside with the professor who's been witness to all of this, and it seems that the two snail children have tunneled their way outside of the pen and made it into the woods behind the school. While looking for the two giant snails, they find a giant cluster of eggs. The teacher rightfully assumes this is probably an affront to God and decides to smash all of the eggs as soon as he finds them. A few days after that, the teacher comes to school as what else but a giant snail. And with that, Chapter 8 ends. So again, this one, inherently silly, I get it, but it's also really unique. Like I said, there's not a lot of places you're going to get the imagery of a person becoming a snail and these super detailed shots of it that make it kind of terrifying. Not that giant snails are terrifying, but the idea of you yourself becoming one is kind of unsettling. It's also one of the reasons that I feel Ito's work is notoriously hard to adapt to like live action or something like that, because as I mentioned earlier, there is a live action Uzumaki that was made in 2000, and it is exactly as goofy and as insane as you could imagine. To try to make it fit better into like an hour and a half runtime, all of the, I think pretty much every single plot I've mentioned to this point is happening at the same time, and then they all kind of end around the same time. And there's, you know, several changes to them, of course, to accommodate for runtime and whatnot. But when they do show effects like the snail kid and stuff like that, it is insanely goofy. And it's like, yeah, the only reason the snail works in any regard is because of the level of detail and the minimalist viewing you get of the creature as it's turning and as it appears. And that being said, I think for the most part, the snail story slides out of the realm of terror and goes more towards the area of like dark comedy. Because it is overall more funny to see a child become a giant snail than it is scary, even if it does have its moments of scare. That's also not a fault on Ito's part. I think Ito's well aware of how goofy or outlandish some of these concepts are, and Ito notoriously doesn't take his work that seriously. He makes a lot of jokes about it. Even at the end of this book, there's this whole section where he's kind of poking fun at the idea of being obsessed with spirals. I think Ito is just a fella out to have a good time, so if he sees something that he thinks is scary, he's going to throw it into the story, and if he sees something that he thinks is funny, he's also going to throw it into the story. There's not a lot of places you can go where you have the image of a child dragged up into the wheel well of a vehicle, and then you flip 20 pages and there's another child who's now a snail. With that out of the way, we now move on to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 begins by talking about something that was mentioned earlier within Uzumaki, the weird lighthouse on the coast of the town. This tall black lighthouse had been abandoned for quite some time, but seemingly for no reason, it begins to show its light every day at dusk. This light is a powerful, intense glow that spirals out of the lighthouse and coats the entire town. As it passes over people, it creates an almost hypnotic glare and seems far brighter than any lighthouse has any right to be. Kirie's younger brother Mitsuo loves the lighthouse and thinks it's really cool, but Kirie, of course, has weird feelings about it. After enough people in town complain about the brightness of the light, some officials from the town go to check on it. However, the people who entered the lighthouse seem to disappear. Over the next several days, people in town find themselves unable to stop walking in circles. When asked by Kirie why they're doing it, they think they're walking on their normal path towards home and it's just taking longer than usual. Again, the spiral light of the lighthouse is causing people to move in spiral figures. It seems that the light is also causing the crew of the ship to behave sporadically as well. Mitsuo and his friends that are also his age want to go get a closer look. So against Kirie's wishes, they run inside of the lighthouse, to which Kirie follows to try to stop them. Not only are the stairs of the lighthouse longer than it appears they should be from the outside, but the lighthouse is completely dark from within. That is until Kirie gets near the top and begins to see an odd glow. As she follows the glow, what else is near the top of the lighthouse than these gentle, glowing spirals that illuminate the darkness? In the dim light of these spirals, she finds the 5 bodies of the men who originally went to investigate, lying charred and burnt on the stairs of the lighthouse. As she makes her way up, she finds 2 of Mitsuo's friends on the stairs who got scared and didn't follow Mitsuo and his other friend all the way to the top. Kirie tells them to get lost as she makes her way to the top of the lighthouse and finds Mitsuo and his remaining friend cowering in fear. As she reaches the top of the stairs, she sees what they're so afraid of, as the once Fresnel lamp of the lighthouse has turned into a giant, pulsating, fleshy eye. It seems that all of the metal and normal structures that once existed within the lamp room of the lighthouse has melted and become this amalgamous flesh. Kirie quickly does the math. This lighthouse puts out a giant glowing light, and lamps cause heat. This room is melted, and there's charred corpses on the staircase. And also, it is almost dusk, which means they need to get out right now. The 3 of them run down the staircase, trying to get out before the lamp turns on. As the lamp begins to power up, the flames, the heat of it begins to chase them down the stairs, getting ever closer. Mitsuo's friend trips and falls, and Kirie turns around to grab him, but it's too late. The fiery blast blows Kirie and Mitsuo down the staircase as Mitsuo's friend is caught up in the flames. While the 2 of them manage to escape the lighthouse, Mitsuo's friend is the 6th victim of the blast furnace created by the lamp. Kirie says in the following days, 6 bodies were recovered from within the lighthouse and that the town has plans to shut it down sometime soon, although she's doubtful if that will actually happen. And with that, we have the end of chapter 9. I like the mystique of this one, the idea that the lighthouse turns on and anything within the lighthouse pretty much gets toasted anytime that it does. Also, I want you to keep the image of the lamp in the lighthouse in mind, because as it turns out, this is one of our biggest clues as to what's truly happening within the town, although you don't know why yet. I'm also just a sucker for like weird, anomalous lighthouse settings. One of my favorite horror films in recent years is Robert Edgar's The Lighthouse. And the idea of like this fleshy eye that's overtaken the lamp and puts out this mysterious glow reminded me of the film. Perhaps there was some inspiration Edgar's got from Ito, because like I said, Ito has inspired just about everyone in horror at this point. As a matter of fact, the Fresnel lamp mentioned by Ito that burned into this unique shape of an eye is the same kind of lamp that Edgar's used in the lighthouse. Could be coincidence or could be inspiration. Who knows, but either way, I think it's cool. With that, we are on to chapter 10. Chapter 10 and 11 kind of run into each other as they're one continuous narrative, similar to how the first 2 chapters were. And it's also, in my opinion, probably the most disgusting and like viscerally horrifying of the whole series, at least in like a gross out kind of way. So viewer discretion, once again. Chapter 10 opens with Kirie in the hospital from her burn she sustained after the lighthouse exploded. Or at least the giant furnace beam of light exploded in her face while she was inside of it. Kirie mentions that Mitsuo's injuries were less severe as Kirie blocked most of the blast from hitting him, so he got out of the hospital early and now it's just her there. Kirie mentions while she's in the hospital, there's an abundance of mosquitoes attacking people in town. We see this firsthand when one of these mosquitoes gets near Kirie and it spins itself in a spiral pattern to lull her into sleep, to which it then bites her. Kirie's friend Shiho shows up and says that the mosquitoes are breeding where else than Dragonfly Pond. Again, Dragonfly Pond is the center of the town next to Kirie's house. It seems to be the source or endpoint with the spiral smoke in the sky of a bunch of the weird stuff that's going on. One day, while walking outside, Kirie finds the body of someone on the hospital grounds that has been totally consumed by mosquitoes. Apparently, this is the first victim of many, as several people are found having been completely drained of their blood by mosquitoes. Particularly, several of the victims admitted to the hospital are pregnant women, one of these women being Kiko, Kirie's cousin. As Kirie is helping Kiko unload her bag at the hospital, there is a weird sort of bent pipe thing inside of her bag that's wrapped up that Kiko tells Kirie not to worry about and just store it with her things. That night, more people are found dead in the hospital, once again having been drained of their blood. The next day, Shuichi shows up as the only voice of reason in the entire story and tells Kirie that she needs to get out of the hospital immediately. Not only that, but after Kiko gets moved into Kirie's room because they're running out of room in the maternity ward, Shuichi says that specifically Kirie should stay away from Kiko. As he's talking, a mosquito shows up in the room, and Shuichi is immediately freaked out by it because for some reason Shuichi is the only person in the story that understands if mosquitoes can drink all of the blood in your body, you should probably be afraid of them. So Shuichi, ready as ever, whips out a can of bug spray and just starts spraying down the room with Kirie and a pregnant Kiko in the room with him. Kirie coughs a little bit, but Kiko gets especially sick from the bug spray, and a nurse asks Shuichi to leave the hospital. Shuichi does, leaving his bug spray behind. That night, Kirie is woken up by a noise in the halls of the hospital. She peeks out her door to see an assembly of haggard-looking pregnant women who are carrying around hand drills and using it to drink the blood of patients. A lot of you probably know this. I feel like at one point this was a fun fact, but now it's just common knowledge. Only female mosquitoes drink blood, and they only do it to provide sustenance for their eggs. So, much like a mosquito, I guess, the pregnant women are drinking the blood of random people through the hospital in order to sustain their pregnancy. While Kirie is watching this, she's spotted by one of the pregnant women. They begin to attack Kirie, saying that they can't let her go because she saw what they were doing. At one point, to catch Kirie, one of the women do the spiral pattern with their finger, much like the mosquito did earlier, and it almost knocks Kirie out. As the pregnant women are beating on the door of Kirie's room trying to kill her, she yells to Kiko to come help her. Kiko gets up, walks over to Kirie, and as you probably figured out, she is one of the blood-drinking mosquito women as well. Kirie thinks fast and grabs the bug spray that Shuichi left behind and sprays it into the air, which immediately cripples all of the pregnant women in the hospital. Because, as we can assume, there's some kind of like mosquito hybrid person thing going on. The next day, all the evidence of this is covered up, and no one suspects the pregnant women to be responsible for the new batch of dead bodies, and Kirie remarks that soon, other children will be born. Now, while there's definitely some gross elements to that, women drinking the blood of men to sustain their unborn babies, like, cool and all, that's not the part that grosses me out. The part that grosses me out is in chapter 11 with what happens to the babies. So let's talk about that. Chapter 11 opens by saying, for the first time in the story, Kirie is using some common sense and trying to tell everyone what she saw. That Kiko and all the other pregnant women in the hospital are drinking men. No one believes her, so Kirie tries to bide her time until she can be released from the hospital. And while she's there, all of the babies are born around the same time. When Kirie goes to see them, she remarks that they're some of the most beautiful babies she's ever seen. Eventually, Kirie is released from the hospital, and as she's leaving, she goes to tell Kiko, albeit reluctantly, that she'll no longer be staying there. Kiko seemingly has no memory, or at least doesn't indicate she has any memory of the strange things going on. The fact that Kiko was drinking people's blood a few days ago. As Kirie is looking at Kiko's baby, she sees that the baby, for some reason, has a very swollen belly. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the babies have a very swollen belly. The baby, seemingly realizing that Kirie is observing it too closely, begins to scream out. And the scream causes, again, a sort of spiral effect on Kirie. She freaks out, runs to the stairs of the hospital, falls, breaks a leg, and winds up back in the hospital. Look, I'm just thrilled she's doing something, other than going to Shuichi and being like, hey, this weird thing's happening. And Shuichi goes, oh, it's the spiral. And Kirie goes, oh, I don't believe you. And then it turns out to be the spiral. At least this time she's trying to move away from the active threat. It's not working, but she's trying. Around this time, Kirie makes the quick mention that all of the food in the hospital, from the soup to the noodles or what have you, all contains a unique kind of mushroom that everyone says tastes really good. Kirie doesn't eat the mushroom, but remarks that everyone else is obsessed with them. One day, as Kirie is walking by the nursery, she hears people talking and goes to investigate to see that the people that are talking are the babies, as they are capable of full speech and a really messed up strategy. The babies are saying that they all wish to return to the womb because they liked it better in there and it was more peaceful and what have you. So the babies are going to convince the doctor that delivered them to put them back in. One of the babies gets so excited talking about this that his swollen belly erupts to reveal a spiral patterned mushroom growing out of the still attached umbilical cord. Kirie is distracted from this revelation when she hears Kiko screaming. Kirie runs to investigate and finds an entire room full of these mushrooms. The doctor who delivered the babies steps out of the room Kiko was screaming in. Kirie asks him what's going on, and the doctor explains that these babies are smart, I guess, and thinking enough that they can communicate what they want, and all of them want to return to the womb. And as a matter of fact, they want to return to the womb so much that they are regrowing their placentas. And regardless of how much the hospital staff tried to cut off the umbilical cords, wherever they dropped the cord, it would immediately grow into this mushroom. The mushrooms, in fact, being regrown placentas. And seeing nothing else to do with them, the hospital staff began to eat them and serve them to other patients. So the thing everyone in the hospitals has been eating is placenta. Okay, this is why I both hate and love Ito, because he'll just drop this stuff on you randomly. Again, there's not, like, think of all the different aspects of horror we've talked about. Snail people, getting hit by cars, and now placenta eating. Like, you're not gonna find it in a one-stop shop, you know, this easily. It's like a dollar store of horrible things. Also, it's clear from like the doctor's eyes and his demeanor that he's not just doing this out of some evil love. He's clearly possessed by the spiral curse or what have you. So he's as much of a victim in this as everyone else. Still very gross. Kirie hears Kiko scream again, and when she runs into the room Kiko's in, Kiko's stomach is now huge as she has been cut open, the baby put back inside, and then stitched together. Kiko begins to cry out that she needs more blood and she needs it now, to which the doctor holds down Kirie and brings him over to be Kiko's next victim. However, Kiko no longer needs a hand drill, as it seems her transformation is near complete, as instead she simply shoots out her tongue and, like a mosquito's proboscis, pretty sure that's the right word for it, it goes into the doctor's neck and she sucks the life out of him. Kirie begins to crawl away as Kiko chases her before two hospital patients, seemingly mesmerized by the spiral as well, see all the shrooms on the ground and begin to eat them. This distracts Kiko long enough that Kirie is able to get out and finally escapes the hospital. Kirie never goes back to the hospital, as you would imagine, and has no idea what happened to all of the people in there. But we can assume for the rest of the story that the hospital is a quarantine zone that no one should step inside of because it's full of the mosquito women who drink blood of anyone who comes by. And yeah, that's the end of chapter 11. Again, it's fascinating how unique the horror can be in a lot of Ito settings. And yeah, something about the placenta mushroom thing, I think, every time I think of Uzumaki, I think of a spiral and I think of the stupid mushrooms because it grosses me out so much. I've always had there's not a lot that gets me anymore just because I've read so much creepy, scary stuff, but cannibalism, still grosses me out in a cannibalism, gross, very brave and unique take. But it's like a specific tick that anytime I hear or see something about it, it just makes me cringe. In a way, not a lot of other bloody or disgusting horror doesn't. So yeah, this one sticks with me. It's also funny because it's like Ito knows different things scare different people. So over the stories, it's here's some for you who are afraid of gore, you who are afraid of cannibalism, you who are afraid of snails or whatever. It's like a buffet for everyone that if you read his works long enough, you will find something that bothers you. This is also the largest direct effect that we have seen of the spiral so far. Because sure, a lot of people saw the hair twisting into spirals. A lot of people were witness to some of the other horrors of the spirals. But this time we see an entire hospital full of women directly possessed by the curse. And it looks like the curse is amping up the speed at which bad things are happening. That's going to continue throughout the rest of the story. Now, chapter 12 gets into a series of events that will stay with us until the end of the book. A storm appears in chapter 12, and the storm is a main occurrence from chapter 12 to chapter 19, all the way to the end. So I want to briefly jump off of that and talk about the Lost chapter. Because as mentioned in 2000, after all of this was compiled, Ito released a Lost chapter of the story that's just kind of a bonus, fun thing that you could sprinkle in your headcanon wherever you wanted through the story. So I figured it was best to mention it now before we get to the series of events that will finish out the book. When the Lost chapter begins, which is titled Galaxies, we can see that it has to occur somewhere between chapter 2 and chapter 6, because Shuichi's parents are dead and he's living by himself, and Kirie has long hair, which means it has to be before the events of the hair event in chapter 6. I didn't mention it then because this Lost chapter has a very big event that happens to a lot of people at once that seems kind of out of place for how the story was ramping up until that point. But now that you've seen the Mosquito Women, I could really say anything and it would make sense. So even though it's not canon, I will briefly go over the events of the Lost chapter. One night, while looking up into the sky with his telescope, Shuichi finds a new galaxy. An astronomer in town named Torino takes a look at the galaxy as well and says that Shuichi has made a marvelous discovery in science, but Shuichi says he wants nothing to do with it. He feels that the galaxy is evil. And of course, the galaxy is what else but a spiral galaxy. As a matter of fact, ever since Shuichi looked at the galaxy, radio waves have been beamed directly into his head, and it's causing him to go mad. At the same time, Torino, who has been looking at this new galaxy as well, is also receiving the same radio beams, and it somehow allows Shuichi and Torino to communicate to each other telepathically. Torino shows up to Shuichi's house and says that the radio waves are telling him if he doesn't kill Shuichi, Shuichi will steal the galaxy from him. Shuichi says he wants nothing to do with this. Again, he's the only sane person in town, at least relatively, and says that Torino can claim the discovery all he wants. Kirie gets word of this, that Torino is claiming the discovery for himself, and goes to Torino, upset, saying that it's not his right to steal the galaxy from Shuichi, and besides, even if Shuichi gave up his right, Kirie was the second to see it, so even if he does give up his right, Kirie is now the discoverer of that galaxy. Also, due to this becoming an event in the town that one of the local boys from town discovered a new galaxy, everyone in town begins to buy their own telescopes and become amateur astronomers. As they do, pretty much everyone in town starts to locate new galaxies, and all of these new galaxies send radio waves into their head. Anytime two people see the same galaxy, they immediately become paranoid that the other person is going to steal the discovery from them. At the same time this is happening, everyone who has viewed any of these anomalous galaxies can hear what everyone else who has viewed a galaxy is saying. It's like they're all speaking on the same frequency. So Kirie, who has viewed an anomalous galaxy, can hear an argument between two people who viewed another galaxy as they get into a fight and one of them kills the other. And sure enough, as she's walking through town, she sees that Torino has come to kill her. Because again, Kirie said, if Shuichi didn't discover it, then I discovered it, and Torino can't let that stand. Torino chases her down, tackles her, is about to kill her when he looks up into the sky and sees that the galaxies are now a lot closer. Torino leans his head up and yells for the galaxies to give him all the radio signals they have, to give him all the information they have, to let him have it. To which knowledge, I guess, or radio waves or electromagnetic waves, what have you, is beamed into his head so fast that his head swells up and explodes. Kirie saying in those final moments, it looked like his head became a small galaxy and then took off into the stars. And with that, everything returns to normal, no one can talk to each other telepathically, and the sightings of new galaxies ends. And with that, we have the end of the Lost chapter. Now this is fun. I like the idea of a guy going crazy. He wants to see the new galaxies. He wants to claim them for himself or whatever. That being said, I also understand why this wasn't included in the original narrative. Because in the original narrative, especially between chapter 2 to 6, we have a slow amping up of the things that are happening in town. It's pretty much just happening to one individual at a time. And then in this Lost chapter that would theoretically fit in before chapter 6, everyone in the town gets either telepathically communicating or people start killing each other or what have you. And it kind of jumps the gun a bit because while you can imagine as the curse is there longer with things like the hospital women, maybe it convinces people to not run away or to not really think about what they saw. This is a pretty early occurrence to drop something as big as the Galaxy plotline in. And another thing it does that I get why Ito took it out of the story is it involves the outside world. The only thing we've seen of the outside world, other than Shuichi going to and from school, but that doesn't really count, is in chapter 4, when Mr. Goshima, Kirie's father, goes to present his pottery, and everyone's like, those are some weird spiral shapes. And that's all the outside world knows of what's happening in town. Whereas throughout the Galaxy story, everyone in town is calling national observatories to report their findings. And as you can imagine, people from outside of the town don't see the same galaxies that they're seeing. But it's an anomalous way that too many people would be tipped off that something weird's going on in the town, at least this early in the story. So a fun chapter. I like the idea of spiral galaxies being used, but again, I get why it was taken out. So with that, let's move into chapter 12 and begin the series of events that will carry us to the finish line. Chapter 12 opens on some of the funniest panels in the entire manga, because it's just Kirie and Shuichi sitting on the beach. And like Kirie's like happy, like, oh, I love you, Shuichi. And Shuichi just wants to die. Like the look in his face is so intense. It's a very funny, like you could imagine just me and the girl I pulled by being strange. Because again, Shuichi is the only one who's like conscious of everything going on. And I think he kind of like forgives Kirie for not understanding because he understands that she's under the curse. And it's like Shuichi's just kind of waiting for the end, but he's willing to do it by Kirie's side. While they're sitting on the beach, all of a sudden, Shuichi begins to freak out and say that a storm is coming. After Kirie comes home to check out the news, sure enough, a large storm is about to hit the coast. As the storm begins, Kirie looks up into it and sees a very detailed eye of the storm. Now, storm eyes are pretty normal. At the center of the storm, there is kind of this ring, not of safety, but of less intensity of the storm, just because that's how storms work. But the eye of this storm seems to be very detailed, so much so that it seems to be a perfectly clear hole in the center of the storm. That night, as the storm is raging, Kirie swears that she can hear a voice calling out to her in the night. The next day, Kirie awakes to what at first appears to be a calm day, only to realize she is in the perfect eye of the storm, as the storm is now stationary over her house. She wasn't the only one who heard the storm calling her name, as her younger brother Mitsuo and later Shuichi mentions that the storm was calling her name as well. Kirie goes to bring Shuichi food, and Shuichi meets her on the way and says that she shouldn't have done that because the storm is chasing her specifically. As Kirie realizes this, the two of them begin to run as the storm picks a tree out of the ground and chucks it at them, temporarily pinning Kirie. A woman who is passing by comes to help the two, and as she does, the storm sucks her up into the sky. After the storm realizes it's a different woman he got and not Kirie, it spits her out and she flies to the ground, dead. Shuichi manages to get Kirie unpinned, and the two of them run and take shelter underneath a bridge. Now, normally a bridge is where you definitely don't want to be during a storm because, wind speeds up, physics, blah, blah, blah. But they're hiding there so that the storm quite literally does not see them. There's this wild moment when, as they're hiding, a piece of debris flies by and knocks a street mirror over and angles it at just the right way so the storm can look into the mirror and see that Kirie is under the bridge. The wind picks up as the storm tries to blow them out, but at the same time it does this, it blows open a manhole cover. Kirie and Shuichi make their way down into the manhole only to see that all of the water in the storm drain has now turned into these spiral typhoons. The storm uses this by speeding up the water so much it creates a water spout that throws them into the sky, and both of them are sucked up by the storm. The storm then carries the two over to Dragonfly Pond, drops them in the water, and then goes away. And with that, the chapter just ends. We haven't mentioned that the storm was intense and brutal, and more storms are on the way. But yeah, it ends for Kirie and Shuichi that they're dropped into Dragonfly Pond, and then Kirie's parents find them, and they're okay. I have a kind of theory that I'll explain later as to why the storm just wanted to drop them into Dragonfly Pond and not, kill them. And since it didn't want to kill him, that makes sense why the storm killed the other girl, because it wanted to suck up Kirie and then when it realized it didn't have Kirie, it just got rid of her, and the fall from that height killed her. But I think it has a reason for wanting to keep Kirie alive. But the whole storm effect is going to be the driving force through the end of the book. And we can see the first effect of that with chapter 13. Also, just now, I was going to move my giant pile of Edo books, and I paper cut myself so hard. Like, it was an incredibly dramatic amount of blood. So, I'm sorry, Edo, for making fun of Kirie. I don't know what more you want from me. Also, I went through my house to get a Band-Aid, and the only one I could find is like, I think it's a Paw Patrol one. I don't know, I've never even seen Paw Patrol. And my wife and I are in our mid-20s. I can't even remember the last time I saw a child. I have no idea what these are doing in my house. This is the scariest thing that's happened to me all day. Forget the placenta mushrooms. I don't know. Anyway, chapter 13 opens with the aftermath of the storm from chapter 12. The Goshima house was totally destroyed, so Kirie and her family need to find a new place to live. I don't know why they just don't go to Shuichi's completely empty house, but whatever. And as they're walking to their new house, the real estate agent, I guess if you could call him that, says something that absolutely infuriates me. He's talking about, oh, sorry you lost your house, blah, blah, blah. But the good news is there's a lot of vacancies opening up because people are moving out. And to that I say, what do you mean people are moving out? Because I was under the impression through this whole story that if you're in the town, you just become possessed by the spiral, and the only reason that Kirie and her family and people like that aren't getting out of Dodge is because they are being slowly cursed to not leave town. So what on earth do you mean people are just leaving town? If that's the case, please get out. It's infuriating because like you put all this together in your mind like, oh, they have to stay because the curse is compelling them to. And the only reason Shuichi can even fathom the idea of leaving is because he hasn't been under, the curse's restraints for that long. But then you have like this real estate agent who's like, I guess people just aren't enjoying the real estate. I like the story, so I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt. There's two options to this. The first option is it's other people like Shuichi who are moving out, other people who don't spend all their time in town and therefore can recognize the curse is weird and they need to leave. And the second option is that people aren't actually leaving town, they're just dying. And the real estate agent is saying, oh, they're moving out, leaving vacancies because more people are dying from what the curse is doing. I mean, we've seen ample evidence of that. Yeah, I remember first time I was reading this when the real estate agent was like, people are moving out. I was like, oh, I see. So the real estate agent must be some kind of instrument of the curse who's lying saying people are leaving when they really are building these houses to get more people in. But no, you never see the real estate agent again. It turns out it just made me angry. Anyway, Kirie's family goes to see their new house, which is one of the old row houses mentioned back in chapter 5. Again, these buildings are much, much older and much more dilapidated than anything else in town. The Goshima family protests this, but the agent explains there's not really a lot of options, so they'll take what they can get. This old row house has a particular legend attached to it. According to local legend, there is a monster that lives in the row house that sneaks out at night and eats people's animals. Well, the family doesn't really care about old ghost stories of a monster, even though they definitely should at this point. They try to adjust to life in the new house. As mentioned earlier, the row houses are designed so that several families can live within one building. So the Goshimas have two neighbors, one on each side. One neighbor seems to be really polite and friendly, while he tells them the other neighbor is a squatter who doesn't want a lot to do with anyone else. Specifically, that the squatters consist of an old woman and her son. The family tries to go say hi to the old lady, but there's no answer at the door. Although that night, they hear a kind of pained moan coming from the old lady's room. Also, while the Goshima family is sitting around, Mr. Goshima complains that there is a pain on the bottom of his foot. When he lifts his foot to show his family, we see a spiral. Again, whatever hoops you want to jump through to imagine why Mr. Goshima, who was so obsessed with spirals earlier in the story, doesn't acknowledge them now, do with it what you will. But as this conversation is happening, we can see that someone is spying on the Goshima family. Supposedly, the old lady or her son from the room next door. The next day, the nice neighbor meets Kirie outside and tells her that the pained moans they heard were supposedly the son of the old lady. He says that according to locals, the old lady's son has some kind of skin condition that makes him unable to leave the house and constantly in agony. As they're talking, the old lady steps outside to do laundry, and as she does, she trips. Kirie runs over to help, but the old lady doesn't want her help. However, as the old lady is standing up, Kirie catches a glimpse of her hand to see that it's covered in these small spiral horns. That night, the Goshima family hears a different kind of crying. Kirie goes over to see what's wrong, and the old woman says that her son has died. We never see what the son looks like, but based on Kirie's reaction, it's not good. Kirie says that whatever skin condition the son had, the mother had as well, and the mother is now being treated at the hospital for this condition. Hopefully not the same hospital full of the mosquito women. Given the coney hands on the old lady, and the fact that the laundry she was hanging up was covered in holes, we can imagine that perhaps whatever these horns were, the son was infested with them. The next day, the nice neighbor really wants to know what the son looked like, although Kirie doesn't want to talk about it. That night, as the family is discussing how the spirals on their body are now getting worse and becoming these outright horns, we see that the person who was spying on the Goshima family was not the old lady or her son, but was instead the nice neighbor. And the nice neighbor is explicitly a creep, as he is perving on Kirie specifically, and even considers making another hole to spy on near her bed. However, as he is discussing this, the neighbor looks down to see that the cones are growing on him as well. It seems whatever infection had overtaken the old lady and her son was now moving on to the other residents of the row house. In the midst of this, a storm begins to set in, and it's so bad that the Goshima family can't leave the row house at all. Because of that, they just kind of have to live in agony with the spiral horns that are growing out of their body. However, one day, the Goshimas begin to hear a noise coming from the neighbor's wall, and when they look, we see that the wall is now filled with these spiral cones. The impression of where the man was pressed up against the wall, spying on the family, the horns grew out of his body and burst through the concrete. And now, having been discovered, the neighbor rips through the wall, exploding as a giant monster of horns and sores. And also, I just gotta say, like, this panel of him exploding through the wall, I love it. It's fantastic. Like, it is classic monster movie terror and body horror and everything else you could think of rolled into one. It's some of my favorite parts about this book and all of Ito's works. It's so much fun. As he bursts through the wall, he sees a rat skitter across the ground. The man reaches down, grabs the rat, and swallows it whole. The family can hardly move due to their sores and are unable to help as the neighbor begins to crawl towards Kirie. The family tells her to run, so Kirie throws open the front door, unleashing the wind and rain of the storm outside. As the neighbor leans over Kirie, a stick that has been broken off in the storm flies through the air and careens into the neighbor's neck, killing him. The chapter ends by telling us that shortly after this, the storm ended once again over Dragonfly Pond. After this, the Goshimas leave the row house, and when they do, the warts that were all over them slowly go away. I've already gushed about how cool the monster is, so what I want to talk about is the storm at the end of the story. See, the first storm we saw in the previous chapter picked up Shuichi and Kirie, dropped them into the pond, and then was seemingly satisfied. And it seems that this storm raged on until the opportunity came to save Kirie. It saves her, and then it's satisfied. So perhaps these supernatural storms that have something to do with the spiral, something to do with Dragonfly Pond, are protecting her for some reason. It could also just be a coincidence. Perhaps I'm reading too far into it and it was just a coincidence that the branch flew through the air and killed him, but maybe not. Now from here, the remaining chapters are all one collective narrative. There's no time skips between or new characters introduced after our initial character introduction. So the final 5 chapters of Uzumaki play out as so. For the first time, instead of beginning our story in town, the story begins just outside of town. As a reporter from a local news station named Maruyama, along with her news crew, are making their way into a tunnel to enter Kurozucho. The news crew remarks that after the 3rd storm, communication in and out of the town seemed to cease. And that at this moment, there have been a total of 6 storms that have hit the town. As soon as the news crew gets through the tunnel, passing into the border of town, a tornado appears behind them, flipping over their car and killing 2 of the news crew members, with Maruyama being the only survivor. As Maruyama begins to make her way to the town by herself, she notices that for one, no cell phone reception works, but also the entire town, save for a few structures, has been reduced to rubble. It seems that whatever happened in storms 3 to 6 that occurred outside of the story was absolutely devastating. As Maruyama is observing the destroyed town, she sees a helicopter fly over, thinking that maybe rescue's on the way. However, as soon as the helicopter flies over Dragonfly Pond, another cyclone appears and pulls it down into the water. At the same time, Maruyama sees 3 young boys who are tied up to poles with gags around their mouth. She does what most people would do and lets the boys down. As soon as the boys get down from the stakes, they pay no mind to her and instead walk over to a building that is almost destroyed, blow at it, causing another cyclone to form, completely destroying the structure. The 3 of them then say they don't care for the woman that let them down and blow another tornado at her. In response, she screams at them as another tornado comes and picks up those 3 boys. Maruyama is very confused by all of this when she is suddenly approached by Kirie and Mitsuo. Kirie explains that any loud noise or sudden movement causes a tornado to form. So it's not that those 3 boys were particularly powerful or had some capability, it's just that they wouldn't quit making tornadoes by blowing loudly. So someone tied them up and bound their mouth so they quit. And that's why, when Maruyama screamed back at the boys, she caused a tornado to be formed and carried them off. Since this series of storms has hit the town, it has become a no man's land. I mean, you can't walk too fast or else a tornado will show up and take you away. That's why the news van was suddenly hit with a tornado, because as soon as they came out of the tunnel and were now in the active tornado zone, the speed and sound of the car caused a tornado to form. It's also why the helicopter was sucked up, because as soon as it got low enough to be in the town, a tornado formed and pulled it down. Kirie goes on to say that Dragonfly Pond pulled in all 6 massive storms that came in from the coast. And it's because of the pressure or weather differential or what have you that was caused by this that everyone in town thinks the new tornado creation thing has began. The only surviving structures in the entire town are the old row houses. Sure, there's some buildings that are on their way to collapsing that are still technically upright, but the row houses are completely untouched. Because of that, when the 3 arrive back at the row house, it is packed with survivors. Maruyama, who's still trying to find help for her news crew that crashed on the outskirts of town, asks all the survivors if anyone will come help her get her crew. The only people who respond to this request are the Goshima family, with other people muttering and mentioning that everyone in town is now trapped and there's no way you can get out. Right before the Goshimas and Maruyama leave, 2 of the surviving boys that Maruyama blew away show back up. They're mad because they say Maruyama killed the 3rd one, so they begin to blow trying to take down the row house, but again, the row house is untouched. In response, everyone in the row house peeks their head out the window and blows back, which blows the boys into the sky. After the boys are blown into the air, we then see that Shuichi is also in the row house, just muttering to himself that everything in the town has gone mad, everything is the spiral, and there's no hope. Everyone then looks back out the window to see that the 2 boys did not die from being blown away, and instead are now riding the tornado, which gives us the lead-in to chapter 15. Because chapter 15 opens by showing us that several people have learned to ride these tornadoes. So these twister gangs now live outside, destroying any aid that arrives and stealing the supplies. It's implied that there's been at least a couple weeks between chapter 15 to this one, because people are beginning to join the twister gangs because they're the only ones that have food. And when they're not stealing food meant for all of the survivors, they're destroying whatever structures are still left in the town. It should also be mentioned, the impression I get from this is that the outside world sees that there is a big storm over the town and they can't get communication in or out, so they just assume it's like a really bad hurricane going on. But again, as soon as someone shows up, they can't get back out and they're trapped in the hole. If you wave your arm too fast, a twister appears reality. We see that Kirie, Mitsuo, and Maruyama are watching the twister gangs, and Mitsuo remarks that he wishes he can join them because they're the only ones that have food. Kirie tells him to forget it, and as they're talking, Maruyama quickly screams, almost causing a tornado, because she just ran into a group of snail people. Yeah, remember the snails all the way back from chapter 8? It turns out that's continuing to happen. People at random are just becoming giant snails. The 3 make their way back to the row house to see that it's more crowded than it ever has been. Because as more rescue crews are getting trapped and seeing the only way they can get shelter is in the row house, the room just keeps getting more packed. It's so bad that people are beginning to live up in the rafters above the row house itself. One of the people in an upper rafter accidentally knocks a hole in the wall, to which an old scroll falls out. He drops the scroll down to the ground and it's picked up by Kirie, who unravels it to see a map of the town, but instead of a town where the town is supposed to be, it is just a giant spiral. If you'll remember, it was mentioned that the row houses are much older than any other structure in the town. So a map sealed in the walls could be as much as 200-300 years old. And apparently at that time, the only map of the town that was needed was a giant spiral, with of course, Dragonfly Pond being at the middle. Shuichi begins to remark about how the whole town is a spiral, everyone's gone mad, and people in the row house, who are getting pretty fussy anyway, are tired of him rambling on, so they kick him out. When the Goshimas and Maruyama goes outside to help him, the people in the row house lock them out, saying they're not going to let him back in. As they're now walking through the ruined town, they begin to talk about strategies for survival. Maruyama mentions that at some point she tried to go back out of the tunnel that the van drove through, but that the tunnel itself began to twist into a sort of spiral, and there was no light on the other side, and she thinks that geometry itself was flipping around to prevent people from walking out. As they're talking, it seems that Mr. Goshima is reverting back to his old ways from chapter 4. Because when asked what he thinks they should do, he says he just wants to go to his kiln and make more pottery with beautiful spirals. Again, I have theories as to why this is that I'll talk about at the end. As they're walking, everyone begins to smell meat cooking, to which Mitsuo gets the most excited and sees that it is the Tornado Gang that is cooking something. Mitsuo says he's tired of not being a part of them, so he runs down to the gang and asks to get in on whatever they're having, only to peek around their shoulder and see that what they are eating is roasted snails. The Tornado Gang has been taking people who have turned into these giant snails and then cooking them. The Tornado Gang tells everyone to come join in on the fun and then make some suggestive comments towards Kirie and Maruyama saying they can join their gang, hint hint. Kirie's dad gets in the way of this and says that won't be happening, to which one of the Tornado Gang members swipes his hand and Kirie's dad is carried off in a cyclone. As soon as this happens, a fight breaks out, with them just like an anime superpower fight, just throwing tornadoes back and forward at each other. Eventually, Maruyama and Kirie are caught up in a tornado, but are able to ride it away, so the Tornado Gang chases after them. As they begin moving towards Dragonfly Pond, Shuichi shows up in the cyclone and manages to grab the two girls and hold them tight against a pole. The Tornado Gang, in their haste of chasing after the girls, got too close to Dragonfly Pond, to which the entire gang is sucked in. Shuichi has seemingly totally lost his mind as he's just hanging on to the girls and the pole, repeating the word mad to himself over and over. And with that, we have the end of chapter 15. It's objectively funny, the idea of like people riding around in tornadoes and throwing tornadoes at each other and stuff like that. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not like Ito takes his work too seriously. He's one of the most often to make jokes about it or laugh about it. As a matter of fact, he did an entire manga that was just based around his wife's cats, where he depicts living with his wife's cats as these monsters that like stalk the halls and he's constantly afraid of. Like, he understands the absurdity of a lot of the stuff that he's getting across, and he loves it. So I think it's perfectly okay to look at stuff like the tornado fight and say it's fun or silly or whatever, and then also remark that, you know, bodies flying out of coffins and whatnot is pretty creepy. Chapter 16 begins with our group of survivors making their way through town and meeting up with other new survivors who again have come in from rescue crews. Two of these survivors are Tanizaki and Takemoto. Between the two of them, they say every way they've tried out of town is blocked, like the tunnel we mentioned earlier, but also they watched a crew build a raft to try to make their way out by sea, to which a cyclone appeared in the water and just sucked the raft down. What's it? There's a word for a cyclone in the water. It's not a tornado, it's a whirlpool. That's it, a whirlpool. Gosh, a cyclone in the water. We learn at the beginning of chapter 16 that Kirie's mom is hurt and now laid up beneath a half crumbled down house, and that her dad still hasn't been found since the fight. Tanizaki and Takemoto are convinced one of the row houses has to have some room, and that's their best bet of finding shelter. Also, the two of them are amongst a group of other survivors, and some of these survivors are having spirals appear on their back, and they're getting very slimy and slow, meaning they're about to be snail people. They say that maybe if they can get inside of one of the row houses, since those appear to be safe, this snail infection won't progress any further. Kirie's mom is down for the count and can't travel, but they say they'll come back for her once they find a row house to stay in. Eventually, the gang makes their way to a row house to find they're not the only people who had this idea, as the outside of the row house is covered by survivors who are fighting with the people inside to be let in. We catch a shadowy glimpse of people through the bars of the row house, and there's so many people in there that it looks like they're physically piled on top of each other. When a group of people who are already at the row house try to throw the door open, a group of people pop out and blow at them, causing a cyclone to carry them off. They come back furious, and after having another tornado fight where both sides are blowing at each other to make the wind go in the opposite direction, the people outside take a battering ram and break open a side of the house, which allows us to see what has happened to the people inside. Remember how back in chapter 5, the whole Romeo and Juliet storyline, the young couple had like twisted into like this long snake thing and wrapped around each other? Well, that's pretty much happened to everyone in the row houses, as they are now a giant mixed conglomeration of flesh. At this initial rupture, both sides of the row house blow open with this flesh blob pouring out in either direction. As soon as the wall is broken, the flesh people use the broken pieces of wood and try to cover themselves up, rebuilding the row house. Our whole crew sees this and immediately says, probably shouldn't go in the row house, because seemingly whatever effect has overtaken them overtakes anyone who tries to stay inside of them now. And we can assume this is what happened to the row house that the Goshima family was originally kicked out of. It also provides some explanation for the events of chapter 5. Remember how the young couple would stay inside of row houses and then they'd sneak away to another row house to be by themselves? Well, it seems that staying in the houses allowed them to recognize whatever this capability was, to kind of give yourself into the spiral. So it seems that now by force, everyone in a row house is forced to take on the same form. Again, the imagery of the two snakes intertwined with each other. As our crew's talking about different options they can do, they look out to the coast and see that the entire Japanese Navy has shown up. I mean, it makes sense, right? You've got hundreds, if not thousands of different people, news crews and, relief workers coming into the area, and then no one getting out or even communicating to the world outside. So the Japanese government sends in the military, everyone cheers, thinks the day is saved, only to watch a giant whirlpool form and sink the entire Navy. The survivors continue their trek back towards Kirie's mom when they remark that they're really hungry, and around this time, they find leftover remains from one of the cooked snails that the tornado gang was eating. Since, the snail is arguably a person and already dead, they all decide to eat, even Kirie. However, some people, like Takemoto, remark that if people among their crew begin to turn into snails, they should keep them around just in case. Which that's like an extra layer, right? You could imagine, this thing that used to be a person died and is already cooked, so we might as well eat it. But it's another to take your friend and wait for them to turn into a giant snail and then eat them at that point. It's a really weird situation to be in, but it's the best part about Ito. The next day, Kirie, Shuichi, and Maruyama get back to Kirie's mom and brother. When they get to the house that they had left them under, it turns out another twister had come by and blew Kirie's mother away, much like her father. Mitsuo is left pinned under the rubble, and when they get him out, Kirie looks on in horror as a shell is growing out of his back. And that is the end of chapter 16. So people in the row houses are becoming these giant blob monsters. The survivors who they are friends with are now considering eating each other if they become a snail. Both of her parents had been lost in the storm, and now her younger brother is becoming a snail. Also, her boyfriend's crazy. Things are not looking good and they need to do something fast. So at the beginning of chapter 17, they make the suggestion of what if they try just walking over the mountains. There's some old trails that lead up around their high school and get pretty close to the brim of the mountain. And since they've tried every other option, might as well. So our group of now 4, Kirie, Shuichi, Maruyama, and Mitsuo, make their way up to the mountains around the border of the town. When they get up there, they can see the level of destruction that has fallen on Kurozucho. Every single structure that is not a row house is completely flat, and there's just roaming cyclones all over town. Shuichi makes an interesting point. Now that all of the other structures are gone, and just the row houses remain, every row house around town that before they just assumed was scattered randomly, But now it seems that every row house, the oldest structures in town, all face Dragonfly Pond. Meaning that in whatever culture or tradition built them that has now been forgotten, for some reason, they made all of their buildings face the pond at the center of town. Furthermore, while observing the row house, they see Tanizaki. Tanizaki was again one of the crew that they were with yesterday when they were trying to find a row house to stay in. Tanizaki is on the roof of a row house building on an extension, saying if they make enough room that theoretically whatever magic is affecting these row houses will affect the extension. So all he needs to do is just keep making room. It's interesting too, with every hammer blow, it's causing a tornado to form, but it seems that none of them are hitting him. It's almost like whatever force is causing everything that's happening in the town to happen is protecting him because it wants him to keep building. As the group makes their way on the trails to the edge of town, the old siren in town that is somehow still standing goes off. It's been mentioned in some of the stories throughout, and I just haven't mentioned it because I want to maintain focus on whatever the narrative of that plot is. But periodically, the siren would show up in stories. While Shuichi's mom was in the hospital, she heard the siren. Kirie would periodically hear the siren. But now it's not going off at 5 p.m. like it used to. Instead, it seems to go off sporadically. Kirie even says that given they just made it to the edge of town, maybe it's going off whenever someone tries to leave. As they're making their way through the trails, they run into Takemoto. Takemoto was again one of the survivors that they were with the day prior. They ask what Takemoto's doing up here, and he asks them the same thing, saying that he watched them walk into the trail, so they've just been following right after them. But somehow, they ran into each other, implying that the trails have looping geometry. Nothing about this town is Euclidean, not even the grass. Literally, while they are standing there talking, you can look at the grass and it's spirals. One of the members in Takemoto's crew is very close to becoming a snail. One of the other members has that guy on a leash. When asked why, he says it's just so the snail guy doesn't decide to run off. Which that's gotta be a miserable existence. You're there with your boys, and then you start becoming a snail thing, and they tie you up so that you won't leave so they can eat you when you become one. That's just sad. Kirie gets worried because her younger brother Mitsuo is going to become a snail any minute now, and she knows what fate will probably befall him if they're still around this crew. Sure enough, the guy they have on a leash becomes a snail, and right before they're about to cook it, Takemoto says no, he wants to try one raw. The snail person begins to hide by receding into his shell, so Takemoto crawls into the shell with him and begins eating him alive. This causes a distraction for our gang to get away. It seems that while initially Takemoto and his people had good intentions, they were just survivors like everyone else, the effect of the spiral has fully gotten to them. The group becomes lost in the woods, and Shuichi looks at a tree stump because by looking at a tree stump you can tell which direction is north. And as he does, he looks at the spiral in the tree and sure enough sees his father's corpse. He freaks out and begins to panic, at which point Kirie and Maruyama begin to discuss how long they've been gone from town. Maruyama looks down at her watch, and the watch hands are bendy and curvy, and time is doing something weird. Also, around the same time, Mitsuo tries to eat grass. Like, it's funny in the midst of this, like he's hallucinating his dead dad and like time paradox and like weird, geometry and stuff. And then it's just like, oh yeah, my younger brother's becoming a snail, so he's eating the lawn now. As they're trying to get themselves together, Takemoto and his crew show up, having just eaten that entire snail guy raw. The gang is still trying to hide the fact that Mitsuo is becoming a snail, so they just say that the large shape on his back is actually a backpack full of clothes, and they definitely shouldn't look at it. And when one of the people in Takemoto's crew offers to carry the boy, seemingly out of goodness, but in reality it's just so he can know for sure if the boy's becoming a snail or not, Shuichi steps up and says that he'll carry Mitsuo instead. And then while carrying him, Mitsuo becomes a full-bore snail on Shuichi's back, with the rest of the crew hilariously trying to cover it up by putting their hands over his eyes to keep his eye stalks from flying out and trying to hide his clothes that have fallen off of him. They hurriedly try to make a path away from Takemoto and his crew so that they won't eat her little brother, with Takemoto saying that they don't have to chase at all because they can move as slow as they want because no one in this scenario can run because it will create a tornado. So with them in a walking chase, they come out of the woods at the edge of the lighthouse cliff. This is troubling because they left town in the opposite direction, meaning that the curse of the town has reset them to the opposite end of the town than the one they tried to exit on. No time to think about that though, because the guys are coming to eat her snail brother, so she takes her brother and tries to push him over the wall of the cliff because, snails can climb on walls. Her snail brother doesn't want to leave her, so Kirie gets a stick and pokes him until he crawls away. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you, that's the last time we ever see Mitsuo. No joke, he becomes a snail, she beats him with the stick to make him crawl away, never see him again. So yeah, that annoying kid from the Lighthouse chapter, that's what happened to him. That's what he deserves. Think you can crawl up into a lighthouse and look at a big light and then get your friend burned to death? No, idiot. Boom, you're a snail. The now three of them, Kirie, Shuichi, and Maruyama, begin to walk away from where they released Mitsuo so that the chasers, Takemoto and them, will think that they still have Mitsuo with them. Takemoto begins to fantasize how good it will be to eat the snail and how good it felt to be inside of a snail's shell, and while fantasizing about the spiral, boom, he becomes a spiral himself. Along with the two other members of his crew, now fully given in and indoctrinated by the curse of the spiral, they become these heaping piles of spiral flesh, just like the people within the row houses. It seems that now the worst effects of the spiral, becoming one like Shuichi's dad did at the beginning, and the stuff that seemingly only happens to the young couple that visited the row houses, are now everywhere. Anyone who gives their mind to the spiral fully succumbs to it. Chapter 17 ends with our three survivors making it back to a hill overlooking the town to see that now, what was once just debris and a few row houses is a giant spiral structure overtaking the entire town. Meaning that for the first time, the image of the town as it is now matches the town as it was written on a map several hundred years ago. Chapter 18 continues with this, with the gang discussing how this could have happened. They were only in the hills for a few hours, maybe a day. Definitely not long enough for the structure to be continued to add it on to this degree. Also, I know I've talked about the jump scare and stuff before, but you're reading about spiral people, then you turn the page and you've got a full spread of the spiral city. I love it. I can't get enough. Any little gripe or complaint I have about with the story is immediately done away by how cool some of this stuff is. Shuichi points out there must be some kind of time manipulation. That while only maybe a day passed for them outside of town, for those within the town, it could have been decades. Shuichi also continues to think about this and points out how all of the row houses, when naturally extended, perfectly built their way into each other as a spiral. He says then that perhaps this is what the original structure looked like. Several hundred years ago, whenever these row houses were built, it was one giant spiral. That pieces of it fell apart over the years, and the only thing they had left in the modern age were the remnants, the few row houses dotted around town. Another thing I want to mention here is this was actually Junji Ito's inspiration to write Uzumaki in the first place. At first, he just wanted to make a story about a group of people who live in row houses, and then he decided an interesting shape for the row house would be a spiral. And then he started to think more about spirals and how they are traditionally used as a positive in Japanese media to convey happiness or childhood wonder, and how in reality it can represent infinity and your eye is led towards the center and all of the weird implications you could get out of it. And then boom, we have Uzumaki, based off the original idea of a weird row house shaped like a spiral. As the three of them are standing outside of the now singular spiral row house, Kirie remarks that even though years have passed, even though she doesn't know what this means, she wants to go in to try to find her family. She says that the other two, of course, should keep trying to find a way out, but that she can't just leave them. And having really exhausted all other options, there's really not a lot they can do. Shuichi and Maruyama agree to go with her. Because, honestly, what else are you going to do? Since it is a spiral, that means there is one location on the outside of the house that begins one singular alley that loops its way all the way to the middle. They also remark, as soon as they get in there, that now they can speak normally and wave their hands or move as fast as they want because the whole creating tornado thing isn't happening anymore. Maybe whatever safety the row houses provide has now been extended to the alleys between itself as well. Meaning that now the gang can run, shout, do whatever they want, and they don't have to worry about creating tornadoes. As they were walking through the alley, the flesh people inside of the houses keep throwing out their dead by untangling them from their masks and casting them into the street. And every time this happens, they ask Kirie and the group to carry the dead off. Kirie can't, as they're weak enough to begin with, but asks them if they know of her parents, to which no one will help her. When they meet Tanizaki, she asks about her father, and he says that he's heard of a potter at the center of the spiral, which is, of course, Dragonfly Pond. He says good luck to them as they make their way there, as not even he has been to Dragonfly Pond, implying the superstructure to be so massive that even someone who travels the alley has never made it to the center. He tells them that there are still gaps within the house that have not been entirely connected, so they can use these gaps to make their way to the center. Tanizaki is also carrying out the dead and seemingly keeping maintenance of the spiral itself. Remember earlier how when Tanizaki was hammering the house, how I said it seemed the tornadoes weren't affecting him? Well, it seems here that the curse or needing to be inside of a house or becoming these spaghetti people or whatever isn't affecting him, because the curse needs him to conduct maintenance of the structure itself, to carry out the dead, to continue building on, etc. So it seems that he's been given a kind of safety to carry out the spiral's will. That night, as they take rest in one of the layers of alleys of the spiral superstructure, Shuichi presents a theory to the two others. Maybe what they're witnessing now has happened before. Again, at some point, centuries ago, this entire place was one spiral building, and the people who built that must have built it for some reason. And here we see history repeating itself, building the spiral once again. He says that perhaps whatever is doing all of this is some sort of ageless, mighty creature that has reproduced these same results over and over. But of course, there's no historical record of this happening. There's just hints. There's things like the map inside of the row house. So Shuichi says perhaps everyone who could have bore witness to it was destroyed. And perhaps that same thing is happening again. As they're in the alley, they see another smoke spiral going down to the center of the spiral, which of course must be Dragonfly Pond. The group begins to run there, and as they make their way through the gaps, the flesh conglomerates on either side of the gap are rapidly building in the walls of the row house. Eventually, the three are making their way through one of the gaps when, just as they cross the other side, Maruyama is caught in the now boarded up walls of the row house. Kirie and Maruyama scream back and forth at each other to try to pull her through, but it's no use. The flesh people are building the wall too quickly. The voices inside of the row house begin to call out to each other that it seems the row house is finished. All of the holes are sealed up, and it is now one continuous hallway. And as soon as the row house is finished, a giant thundering noise starts at the outside and circles its way all the way to the center of the spiral. As soon as this is over, Kirie and Shuichi step inside of the row house to see that everything that was inside of those walls has been sucked to the center of the spiral. And as you can imagine, after this, Maruyama is never seen again. She was likely carried away with the rest of the people that were also carried away when the row house was finished and everyone was pulled to the center, pulled to Dragonfly Pond. The two now simply walk their way through the row house, and when they get to the very end, they see that it opens up to what was at one point Dragonfly Pond, but has now been drained to reveal an ancient staircase. With no other way out or no other explanation for any of this, the two step into the staircase hand in hand, and we are now led in to our final chapter, chapter 19. The two of them walk their way down a spiral staircase that is seemingly without end. Kirie doesn't know how long it's been, and there's no indication of when the stairs will end. As they're making their way down, they come across one of these untangled spaghetti people seemingly lying dead on the staircase. However, when they step over this person, they spring to life and asks for the two to carry them down to the bottom. Because, as they say, there's something beautiful down there. Kirie says they don't have the strength, and in anger, the person latches out and bites Kirie. Shuichi tries to pull him off of her, to which this thing wraps around Shuichi, and the two fall off the stairs into the pit. Kirie screams and begins to run down the stairs as fast as she can, desperate to save Shuichi, if that's even possible. As she is running, Kirie suddenly sees a light. As the light gets closer and closer, she sees that her staircase ends, and instead, a staircase atop what seems to be a giant monument begins. Looking over the edge of the staircase, this monument seems to be hundreds and hundreds of feet tall in this cavern underground, with spiral imagery and spiral shape occurring everywhere. She tries to slowly drop herself down onto the staircase of the spire, but instead she slips and begins to fall. Instead of falling to her death, it seems that as if some cyclone or some wind slowly carries her down to where she lands gently on the ground, only to realize it's not ground at all, but instead a giant horde of the spiral people that were sucked out of the row house. All of them calm and silent and looking at something. And when we see what they're looking at, it is my favorite panel of the entire manga. Some old, unexplainable god hidden beneath the earth. I can't explain how good this is. Just turning and seeing a full page spread of this unexplainable city of spirals. Like as soon as I got to this page, I'm like, Uzumaki's a classic. I'm not forgetting it. I'm in. Everything in the city of spirals lets off a soft glow. Even though they are maybe miles beneath the earth, it's as if it's daylight from the intensity of the spirals around them. Every one of the twisted people is calm and quiet and gently staring in awe of the giant spiral at the center of the metropolis. Kirie walks around, calling for Shuichi. She notes that as she gets further from the center of the city, that the spiral people on the ground slowly turn to stone. It's as if they've been calcified the longer they've been in here. And as she is walking and looking at the faces on the ground beneath her, she sees none other, side by side, than her father and mother. Again, while she lost the two of them seemingly days before, both of them were blown away in years within the center of the spiral decades ago. So it seems the two of them succumbed to the fate that now many others have, but at least they did it together. Kirie finds Shuichi. He's been hurt from the fall, but he's still alive. Shuichi makes an interesting point. The natural form of a spiral is to draw the eye, right? Anytime you look at a spiral shape, your mind is drawn to the center of it. A spiral is a shape that inherently wants attention. And this being of infinite light and time and energy has been neglected for so long, being so far under the earth. So perhaps every few centuries, every few millennia, every few tens of millennia, it is able to break through the surface and make its name known. Maybe everything that's happened in Uzumaki, everything from the individual stories that have beset their two families, to the people that have been cursed one by one, to everyone that is now dead on the floor beneath a forgotten god, maybe it was hopeless in the first place. Maybe this is something greater than them, something that's a part of time infinite, that they are helpless to do anything about. And in this moment, maybe that's okay. Because as Shuichi mentions, he can't move. And although he begs Kirie to go on without him, she can't do that either. So the two of them join hands, and in that moment, succumb to the spiral. Their arms and bodies begin to twist and bend and turn around each other. And with Kirie and Shuichi giving themselves over to the spiral, it now means that everyone in town is gone. And now this nameless god stands before his forced congregation and lets out a loud cry. With their deaths, a loud blare is heard, reminiscent to the blare that was heard over the foghorn in town time and time again. And the spiral in the middle of the city reveals itself to be a sort of drill, as it begins to trace its way up the tracks of the staircase, all the way to what was at one point Dragonfly Pond. The seen and the unseen now made one at last. And the story ends on these words. And with the spiral complete, a strange thing happened. Just as time sped up when we were on the outskirts, in the center of the spiral, it stood still. So the curse was over the same moment it began. The endless, frozen moment I spent in Shuichi's arms. And it will be the same moment when it ends again, when the next Kurozucho is built amidst the ruins of the old one, when the eternal spiral awakes once more. And with that, we have the ending of Uzumaki. Now, the ending of Uzumaki is one of the most criticized parts of the entire story. From most of what I see online, this is the majority of people's problem with the story. They see it as Kirie and Shuichi were fighting against the evils of the spiral, of the curse, and at the end, they lose the end. However, I don't see it that way. As a matter of fact, it's the ending of the story that makes it for me. Because I never saw the spiral curse as something that could be bested. It was only something that they were victim to. Everything that has happened up until this point in the story is absolutely unexplainable by any realm of even paranormal reason. We have time dilations, we have mosquito women, we have people becoming snails, we have any aspect of a spiral making its presence known in ways humanity can't counter. And at the end, when we see what this God is, when we see that it's some being our minds can only put together as a shape, that makes sense to me. Because all of these unexplainable events can only be explained by something equally unexplainable. When we see the giant spiral city at the end of the story, it's not that it is literally a shape that has caused all of this. It is a creature, it is a God that is so far out of humanity's understanding that the best we can amalgamate its presence as is a thing that draws the eye. A symbol of infinity that demands attention. Dare I use the words cosmic horror or Lovecraftian, something that Ito directly cites as an inspiration for this work. It is something so unexplainable that in that is where its terror lies. The closest we saw earlier in the story to the spiral's true form was the image within the Lighthouse chapter. Not only did we get so many details there, from spiral shapes that are naturally glowing, just like we saw in the cavern at the end, and the Fresnel lamp of the lighthouse melting into a giant spiral eye, which is what the god shows itself to be at the end of the story. What did this lighthouse do? It let out an impossible light that melted or overwhelmed the minds of anyone that looked at it. In much the same way, the true form of this god does the same thing to its victims or its congregation. All those who were transformed into effigies of its true form were made as these mindless followers to stare at it for time at infinity. And time is another thing that has no meaning to this god. While on the outside it could be centuries or thousands of years before it ever acts again, for the god itself, it could be doing this repeatedly, constantly, with moments apart. If it controls time, then it can simply sit down there, figure out how much time needs to pass on the earth above before it can cause another batch of disciples to fall, and then simply be at that time in history to do it all again. At the same moment all of this happened was the same moment it ended and the same moment it will end again. The true terror of Uzumaki isn't a girl whose eye falls into her spiral face or a boy whose body is hopping around in a graveyard. The true terror is what is humanity when faced with something that we can never even hope to understand, much less defeat. What does humanity do in the face of the truly unexplainable and, even worse, malicious? And it also brings up what I believe is the reason for Kirie's involvement within the story. I joked a lot and talked a lot about, oh, why doesn't Kirie just move away? Why don't more people get out of town? Why does her dad seem fine one minute and then gone the next? But in reality, I think it's for this ending. And I think it's something the spiral has planned from the start. Other than the row houses, which seem to be dilapidated structures almost left behind on accident, I think even if all of the row houses in town were destroyed, the story would end the same way, with them being rebuilt. The only direct thing we see that calls back to what the spiral god once was is the map that is found within one of these row houses. That means that at least one person from the last time this happened managed to take record of what the spiral was before they too succumbed to it. What I think this means is that the spiral doesn't just want a congregation, it wants a prophet. And I think Kirie was that prophet. These are the opening lines of the manga, all the way back in issue 1. This is Kurosacho, where I grew up. I would like to share with you the strange events that took place here. Of course, being told from the point of view of Kirie. And the final moments of the manga are Kirie describing that last moment in Shuichi's arms before proclaiming the infinity of the spiral. I think the reason Kirie never wanted to get out, I think the reason that she was seemingly oblivious to the events that happened around her, I think the reason that she never learned to be ahead of the spiral is because she never had a chance. I think she was the spiral's puppet from the start. Think about how all of the events conveniently happen around her. It's her father who becomes obsessed with the spiral, just like Shuichi's dad was. However, seemingly, after the oven blows up, her father is just released. Not to die, but to continue to be a voice for the spiral in her ear. Shuichi lost both of his parents, but he himself was not lost at any point because again, he serves as a vessel for everything that's happening to be delivered to Kirie. Her younger brother not only survives an encounter with the Lighthouse, but goes on to become a snail, one of the worst effects that the body can experience within the spiral. Every event, every manifestation of the spiral's power is witnessed by her, and the spiral goes out of its way time and time again to make sure she's around to tell that story. Not only did the storm pick her up and throw her to the heart of everything that's going on, but when she was attacked by the infected neighbor inside of the row house, the storm saved her by throwing a pole through his neck. Not only do I think our protagonists were helpless from the beginning, I think they were more of a victim to it than anyone else. I think that this god wanted a prophet, and Kirie was that prophet. Which is where the true horror of Uzumaki comes. Because not only is it a hopeless story of helpless people who cannot stop the evils they're fighting, it is a story that as soon as you open the first page has already been lost. And that is one of the reasons I absolutely love it, because the nihilism of that realization, the terror that these characters are in, cannot be overstated. And it's one of the reasons I love Junji Ito so much. And hopefully if you've stuck around this long, you enjoy it too, and that's really cool. And I just want to say thank you for watching. I love Junji Ito so much. All of his stories are so weird and crazy and over the top, and all of the events I talked about in that one, there's nowhere else that you're going to get that level of horror and terror, or at least that many flavors of horror and terror all in the same place. It's got body horror, it's got cosmic horror, it's got like gore horror, it's got slasher horror. It's all of it. It's like put it in my veins. I love it so much. And you want to know the craziest thing? I've gushed about it, talked about how much I loved it. Even the criticisms I had of the story are overridden by the ending. And again, this is all my theory, because I really like it and I think that theory works the best. I stick by it, but it's not explicitly told to us. And I kind of like it's not explicitly told to us because it allows it to work so well. But even with all that being said, I think Uzumaki is one of my least favorite Ito stories. It's not the bottom of the list, but I just think there's so many things that incorporate the horror so much better. I wanted to talk about Uzumaki because I think the ending's really interesting, and it's definitely one of his more popular, but it's definitely not my favorite. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I would love an excuse to talk about more of Ito's works in the future. Either another one of his long books, like Tomie that I mentioned, or Hellstar Rimina. I really love that story. I talked about his adaptation of No Longer Human in my video about No Longer Human, and I've talked about the Frankenstein one, so I wouldn't make an own video about those. Or I could cover a lot of my favorite short stories. Either way, I really love his work and would really love to talk about it again. So if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more, let me know. We'll see how this video does, and that will determine if I dedicate more time. I have no idea what this video will be, but if I dedicate the same amount of time again to another story, we'll see. But yeah, I loved it. Thank you all for giving me an excuse to talk about it. It means the world. Is there anything else I want to say or announce? Podcasts are growing great. Thank you all so much for that. The WeirdBible Podcast, which has been down for a while because I've been dumb and bad about scheduling, is now back up. Link to that will be in the description. I don't think there's any merch drop. I mean, there's some coming up soon, but none like immediately. Stay on the lookout for that. Thank you all so much for the support that you showed the Cryptid on Tour I've been talking for a while if you can't tell. Thank you all so much for the support that you showed the Cryptid on Tour shirt and the Conspiracy Iceberg beanie. You all showing that level of support lets me make even cooler and more out there, stuff with merch companies and things like that. They see that my audience has an interest, so I can pretty much do whatever I want. And pretty much my entire life, I've been able to do whatever I want thanks to you guys. It means the world. I say this all the time, but the livelihood I have and the blessings I've been given are a product of you all, and I don't forget it. So thank you very much. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. It will either be releasing on or around Easter, so happy Easter. I hope that you guys enjoyed. And yeah, I'm gonna get this sent over to the editor. Thank you, Caitlin, for editing this. It means the world. You're the best. I'm gonna get this sent over to the editor so you all can see it sooner. And I hope that you enjoyed. But I believe that should do it for now. Again, I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.